Hello, everyone. We are live for our second general adversarial collaboration. Before we get started, I just briefly want to introduce what this is about and who we are as a program committee. So CCN's program committee this year was Nico Krieges-Korte, Megan Peters, Ralph Heffner, Gemma Roig, Eric DeWitt, and Jennifer Lieberman. And today I will be co-hosting, so my name is Gunnar Blom. I will be co-hosting with Ralph Heffner. And in the background, we have Megan Peters, so the account that says Cognitive Computational Neuroscience, that's Megan here. And I want to mention Megan in particular because the GACs are really thanks to her. It was her idea. She put it together. She put all the work into it. And so thank you, Megan, for that. And this has been very exciting so far. And so we're looking forward to today's session. So what are the GACs all about? Well, we can all agree that science benefits from alternative ideas and theories. But too often, researchers try to prove their own theory right instead of really critically asking what the right theory is. And this is where we think that the GACs can help. So researchers will essentially come together, researchers with alternative hypotheses will come together and collaborate to resolve their differences in views. So how will they do that? Well, together, they will work out what they think is the best, fairest way to disambiguate their point of views. And we think that's really important to do. It's, of course, a healthy, friendly, collaborative environment that we want to generate, but we also want to accelerate progress through the GACs. We also think GACs have a lot of benefit for the CCN community. We will, of course, foster an open public debate, which is a learning opportunity for everyone, including our most junior participants. But more importantly is that we would like to have more of a community engagement to science. So we want to encourage people to work out the differences together. And we think that the more people participate in these processes, the better it is for science, because from diversity and numbers come the interesting ideas. We hope that the GACs will also allow science to actually work out as a community what really the important questions are that we need to answer. And so the GACs, we hope, will provide a democratic platform to decide what's important and then essentially provide an organized collaborative effort to answer those important questions. Throughout, this is designed as a very transparent process. So the proposals were all on open review, are still on open review. You can access both the proposals and the reviews. The GAC kickoff, which is today, official kickoff, will be made public, of course. It's public right now and free. This will lead to a position paper and associated outcomes in the future. Now, the fact that all these aspects and their timeline will be available should also allow anyone who gets engaged to get engaged at any point in time, but also really to see the history and evolution of the arguments and the reasoning behind the arguments. Okay, so in total, we have 6 GAC events. Last Thursday, the first one started off. Today, we essentially have the one entitled, Is It That Simple? The Use of Linear Models in Cognitive Neuroscience. And then there's 4 more to come this week. So I encourage you to check that out on the CCN website. And with that, I would like to encourage everyone to participate, get involved, and have fun. So to participate, I would encourage everyone to use the chat on the webinar and use the Q&A. So if you want to ask a specific question, please put the question in the Q&A, it's not in the chat. If you do want to use the chat for anything, by default, any comment you put in will only be addressed to the panelists, not the attendees. And it would be nice if you could share your thoughts with everyone. So please select that your message should go to the panelists and the attendees. And with that, I hope you'll all have a lot of fun. And I will pass the mic now to the organizers. of this particular session. So we'll essentially have sort of like 3 or 4 sections this morning and early afternoon in my time, of course. So first we'll start with a section called Setting the Stage, where essentially sort of like the main proposal is and the issues are laid out. And then there will be 2 particular debates that are more specifically focusing on vision and on language. And then we'll have a more open debate on pretty much anything in general. And so Anna Ivanova will start with explaining to us what the proposal is all about. And so if I stop sharing here, then Anna can share, I think.
Thank you, Gunnar. There we go.
Awesome.
All right, I would like to start by thanking the CCN organizers for giving us an opportunity to host this workshop. We are very excited about it. And as Gunnar mentioned, we really want this workshop to be interactive. We really want to hear from you and hear your ideas. So please ask and upvote questions in the Q&A box. Since the proposal will have multiple sections, we ask you to mention who the question is for, and then you can also discuss the ideas in the chat in a more free-flowing forum. We are also going to be setting up a Slack that you can use after the workshop is over. If you want to continue the conversations, watch out for the link to the Slack in the chat. This is our team: Martin Shrimp, Leila Isik, Stefano Anzalotti, Noga Zaslavsky, and Ev Fedorenko. Martin and Leila are team linear. Stefano and I are team nonlinear, and Noga and Ev are on the advisory part of the team. We all got together back last July to write a proposal for this GAC. And in August, we received feedback from the community on open review, which was super insightful, and we really hope we're going to be able to incorporate it for this workshop and going forward, which brings us to the workshop today. But as you can see, the process doesn't end here. The result of this workshop is going to be an opinion piece that we're going to write summarizing the discussion that we are going to have today. And we really want to draw your attention to it because in the spring of 2021, CCN is going to be soliciting peer commentary for the opinion piece. And so we really encourage you to write commentary pieces and share your opinions on these questions. Okay, so what are we gonna do today? We're going to start with 2 introductory talks, followed by 2 specific debates in the domain of vision and language. And then we're going to have a panel discussion where we can go into whatever questions you all have in more detail, as well as cover the domains outside of just vision and language. All right, so what is our proposal about? In short, it is about models that map between neural activity and some variable of interest. What do I mean by that? Imagine a brain that we want to understand. We want to know what the brain does and how it works. In order to do that, we might want to record neural activity, say across neurons or across voxels or across EEG channels. And then we want to relate it to some variable that we think is going to be informative of the underlying neural processes. And this variable can take on many different forms. It might be a categorical representation of the stimulus that the brain owner is viewing, like faces, body parts, and objects. It might be a layer of a neural network that is hypothesized to be performing the same function as this particular part of the brain. It might be brain activity in a different brain region, or it might be the behavioral output of the brain's owner as their brain activity is being recorded. And as you can see, the mapping can go in 2 directions. If we are going from a variable of interest to neural activity, we call this an encoding model. If we're going from neural activity back to the variable of interest, it's a decoding model. for the purposes of this workshop, we're going to assume that it doesn't matter which direction we're going into, that the same considerations are going to apply for encoding and decoding models. If you think that the direction really matters, please let us know in the Q&A. So these yellow arrows is what we call the mapping model, the mapping between variable of interest and neural activity. And the key question of today is, what do we want this mapping to look like? So to formalize it just a little bit, I am going to call the variable of interest X and neural activity Y. And the question is, what is the linking function between X and Y? And the simplest linking function you can, or one of the simplest functions you can imagine, is a linear mapping. So Y is proportional to X, maybe with some kind of offset. And the way this mapping can be established is just through a linear regression. But of course, that's not the only form that this mapping can take. In fact, there are many, many forms of nonlinear mapping, such as polynomial, logarithmic, sigmoid, and an infinite number of other functions that you can imagine. And for the practical purposes, they can be approximated with a multi-layer perceptron or a neural model that we can stick in place of the yellow arrow, and it will approximate any function for us in principle. But most of the time in cognitive neuroscience, we don't do that. Most of the papers and studies stick with linear mappings between a variable of interest and neural activity. And this is the key question that we want to examine. Why are linear models so popular? And is this popularity justified? So I'm going to go over 3 big reasons why linear models are popular and discuss whether or not this reason should be questioned. This is in no way a comprehensive list, so please let us know in the Q&A if you think of other reasons why linear models are good or bad. The first reason I want to talk about is biological plausibility. The argument goes as follows. We have a population of neurons in a particular area encoding some information, and then this information is passed to a downstream area where it is read out linearly. So the input that the neuron in blue receives is the weighted sum of the outputs of the gray neurons. And the reason why we should be using linear mapping models is because they approximate what the brain already does. Essentially, a linear classifier just models this linear readout by a downstream area. And we might want to question the linear readout assumption by itself. We know that neurons perform many nonlinear computations. In particular, when there are more and more papers coming out showing all the various kinds of nonlinear computations that can be happening in the dendrites, which would make the linear readout assumption invalid. But even if we assume that the linear readout is true, it's still not necessarily a reason to stick to linear mapping models. And the reason why is because in cognitive neuroscience, we often model not just a particular limited brain area, but large chunks of the brain, or sometimes even the entire brain. And so if you have a linear model that uses information in every single voxel across the entire brain, the only entity doing the readout is the experimenter. There isn't a hypothetical downstream brain area that could be reading out information from the entire brain in a linear fashion. That's pretty implausible. And so when we're using the linear readout assumption, we should be very clear what kinds of models should be relying on it, which kind of models should be limited by this biological plausibility argument. And the second reason why linear models are so popular is because they're considered to be more interpretable. This reason came out quite a lot in the reviews we got back in August. Essentially, the claim is that large nonlinear models are just too complicated. They do all the work for us and they don't tell us anything interesting about the brain. So we shouldn't be using them. We should be using simple models. And oftentimes, people who use this argument give the famous retina example. You can imagine a participant viewing a stimulus, such as a dog, and then you can record activity in their retina and stick a complicated multi-layer neural network on top of the retina that will be able to identify the image being viewed as a dog. And the argument goes that this didn't tell us anything about the features that the retina represents, anything about the computations that the retina is performing. So it wasn't really helpful for understanding what this particular part of the nervous system does. But I have a couple counter arguments for this one. The first one is that uninterpretable models can still be useful. Imagine the same experiment, but now instead of viewing a stimulus, the participant is looking at a blank screen and is asked to imagine a dog instead. And if the same neural network can identify that the dog is being imagined just from the retina signal, that would be a groundbreaking discovery that would tell us a lot about how mental imagery works in the brain. So you don't need to understand every single part of your model and explain it in words in order for it to be useful. The second counter argument is that not all linear models are interpretable either. For example, this is a famous example from the DiCarlo lab that shows a mapping between a convolutional neural network and the ventral visual stream. Well, the claim here is that each layer of a convolutional neural network roughly corresponds to a particular visual area. And the mapping between each neural network layer and each brain area is linear. But if you think about the weights that are connecting a layer with a brain area, they aren't particularly interpretable. They connect a unit from a neural network with a neuron from the brain, but it doesn't really tell us anything about the features that are being represented in this area or the computations that it performs by itself. And so we want to really be clear what we mean by interpretability and which models benefit from being fully interpretable and transparent, and which models might be useful without satisfying the strictest interpretability constraints. The third argument is a practical one. Essentially, the argument is that neuroimaging datasets are often small and noisy, and so it's impossible to fit nonlinear models because they will overfit and just won't perform well in practice. And indeed, there are some studies showing that nonlinear models just don't perform as well as their linear counterparts or perform on par with them. But this situation might be changing. More and more large data sets and high quality data sets are becoming available in cognitive neuroscience. And if the only reason not to use nonlinear models is a practical one, is a data limitation reason, then we just need to figure out how much data we need to be able to leverage the power of nonlinear models, and then make sure we're collecting large and high quality data sets in order to be able to answer the questions we want to answer. All right, so I've outlined several reasons why we might want to use linear models, 7 reasons why we might not want to use linear models. Essentially, the picture is quite complicated. So what should we do about it? Our goal for this proposal, so the workshop and the following few months, is to develop a set of guidelines for using linear versus nonlinear mapping models. And we are proposing a two-pronged approach. It will be based on theoretic considerations, such as insights from information theory. I won't be able to go into this in a lot of detail, but just to provide a brief example, oftentimes the objective for mapping models is considered to be maximizing the mutual information between neural activity and the variable of interest. And so if the main thing we want for a mapping model is to maximize mutual information, then we really shouldn't be restricting ourselves just to the space of linear models. We really want to be using the most powerful model that will provide us with the best lower bound on mutual information. And if we want to impose other constraints, such as interpretability, we want to be able to quantify them and incorporate them into this objective function. The second consideration is practical, So not only do we want to have a theoretic justification for our models, we also want to make sure that they do perform well. And so we are planning to evaluate directly linear versus nonlinear models on a predefined number of data sets. And of course, the answers that we are going to get might actually depend on the specific question we're asking and the specific domain we're examining. So for vision, audition, language, theory of mind, and action, maybe all of them will benefit from nonlinear models in the same way. Maybe they will benefit in different ways. And another important variable to consider is the modality of neural recording. Whether it's single-cell recordings, ECOG, MEG-EEG, or fMRI, the answer for which model to use might vary depending on the recording modality. And so we propose to evaluate 3 different data sets: single-cell recordings in vision, fMRI recordings in vision, and fMRI recordings in language, which will hopefully allow us to see which of our conclusions are specific to a particular modality and which are generalizable across. So let us know what you think about the proposal and the questions that we're setting up. I would like to thank you for your attention. And before we move forward to Martin's talk, there is actually a poll that we have for you to see where you stand on the linear versus nonlinear debate.
And I will be monitoring that poll. So if everyone could please cast their vote while Martin gets ready, and then we can have a quick summary of that.
Am I good to go ahead?
Yeah, you can share your screen.
Okay. So it's still disabled for me. Thank you.
Great, and people can continue voting if they want. It looks very much like a almost a flat distribution, with the extremes being slightly lower, but everyone is sort of undecided between 3 and 8. So there's sort of like a flat curve here between 3 and 8, which is kind of interesting. And we can come back to that, of course. Okay, so everyone should be able to see that. Is that correct? You can now look at the poll results. Perfect. Okay, while everyone looks at that, Martin, why don't you take it away?
Okay. I'd like to start by thanking Anya for really initiating this workshop and really doing the bulk of the organizing. I think there's a lot of interesting questions here, and the good participation already shows that. Okay, so I'll try to put up 5 assumptions as a way of trying to ground the following discussion. To contextualize the points and give some more background on why I think a certain way, I'll also try to refer to research results, both myself and others. And I think following one comment in the chat from Jessica Thompson, I'll also try to make a more clear distinction between what we mean by brain models, mapping models, and behavioral readout models. I think the first 3 assumptions are hopefully agreed upon, and then I think most of the discussion might be on assumptions 4 and 5. Okay, so assumption 1, we want to build an accurate model of the brain. Really, this means as the years progress, eventually we want to match the brain more and more closely. This can be in vision, language, or other domains, but eventually we would like to explain the variance that there is to explain. The main reasons why we want this, or the benefits, are roughly threefold. So in terms of research, these models that now match the brain better and better are basically unified hypotheses that integrate experimental results. And we can also use these models to focus experimental resources on those aspects of brain function that are not yet captured. So for instance, we might want to start collecting those kinds of data where models make maximally different predictions. as a way of then further differentiating across models again. There's also benefits for AI, where there's already first results showing now that models that are more brain-like do better at generalizing to new distributions. They also seem to be more robust to image corruptions as well as adversarial examples. And there might also be some first results of these models becoming more energy efficient. In the limit, if we had a model of the brain, then of course all these should be fulfilled. And finally, there's also a case to be made for brain-machine interfaces and brain disorders. We already have first results where we can synthesize stimuli to control neural populations. You can think of this as a way of pushing populations in the right state for some desired behavioral output to maybe one day fix actual disorders. Or you could also think of using these models to create stimulation patterns that could elicit visual percepts, which might one day benefit blind subjects. Assumption 2. To decide which model is most accurate, we test models on many benchmarks. And really this is maybe a bit of a next step paradigm where instead of collecting one set of data and building one model for it, and then collecting another set of data and building a different model for it, and never really integrating across these data sets or models, which is basically the piecewise effort regime that we've necessarily spent a lot of time on. So this was definitely necessary. But it might limit our ability to actually constrain the models and guide what the next steps should be. So what we are, I think, trying to move towards as a field is this domain of integrative benchmarking, where we actually collect or integrate many sets of data and together use them to constrain models, and then build models that not just match one set of data, but ideally match all past, present, and future data. So as a cartoonish way of saying this, maybe that will help us to see the whole elephant, at least in one domain, rather than only subcomponents. Assumption 3, where the brain makes nonlinear transformations, mechanistic brain models are also nonlinear. This is maybe where I put myself on the nonlinear side. So if you think of, for instance, vision and ventral stream processing, when an input comes in, it's processed by regions V1, V2, V4, and RT. And over many papers and many experimental results, it's been pretty clear that these transformations and the representations in these regions are not just linear transformations, but they're actually pretty nonlinear. So in my mind, that makes a pretty compelling case that the brain models that try to match this ventral stream processing should also be nonlinear. Now, of course, this is not just vision, but same for language and other domains, where if the brain computations are nonlinear, then I think we should obviously allow our brain models to also be nonlinear. So to give some more context, just with these 3 assumptions, I think there's been a range of pretty cool results that basically arise from models that we can now evaluate on not just one benchmark, but any benchmarks, and which now help us to reveal some broad trends. So mostly when we compare models and primates in, again, different domains, the sort of bread and butter that we do is that we compare the internal representations. So from the model, we usually record the hidden unit activations. From primates, humans, as well as non-human primates, we record, for instance, future array recordings, fMRI and ECOG, MEG, and so forth. And then we try to compare these 2 sets of representations. I personally usually prefer to use model representations to predict the primate representations. And that at some point gives us a neural score that tells us how close are the model representations to the brain representations. But then also we compare behavioral outputs. So we can ask models to perform a certain behavior, such as object categorization or predicting the next word. And we can do the same for primates. And then again, we can compare these 2 sets of behavioral measurements. And again, we can go from the models to the primates by predicting behavioral measurements from primates with behavioral measurements from models. And that's going to give us a behavioral score. And then the models can also perform tasks, again, such as object classification or other things that we don't necessarily compare to primates, but that we can put in relationship with respect to computation task score with the other neural and behavioral scores. And I'm going to show you some examples of some, I think, pretty cool work that has done this. So one on the left is the work by Dan Yeomans and Ha Hong, where you see on the x-axis the object categorization performance, and on the y-axis the explained variance in IT, so high-level visual cortex. And this is one of the first instances where there's a pretty clear correlation between certain tasks that models are doing, and really it's a range of models, it's not just one model, and the neural scores of these models. This has then recently been extended to behavior as well by Rishi Rosalingam and others, where on the right, you see a plot of model performance, or the computation task score on the x-axis versus now a behavioral score of human consistency on the y-axis. And again, you see this link between these three measurements, which we've recently been able to extend a bit more with many more models and just about more data. So this is now measurements of neurons and behavior, and really it's, again, many data sets. In this case, it's measurements from V1 through IT in this brain score framework that we're trying to establish. And you again see this correlation of a computational task score on the x-axis versus neuron behavioral scores on the y-axis. And really you can find pretty neat links between all of these. For instance, you could connect IT scores to behavioral scores and many others. This has also been extended to other domains, such as audition, this work by Alex Kell, and language on the right, where in all of these cases, I think it's pretty neat that we can connect these three measurements of brain function, behavioral outputs, and a computational task. However, all of these benchmarks rely on certain assumptions to map between models, neurons, and behavior. And I think this is now where assumptions 4 and 5 will come in that I'm personally hoping we spend most of the time discussing. So assumption 4, to map brain model to brain, we want the minimal function, which also works for brain-to-brain mapping. So to describe a bit what I mean is, imagine you have two participants, two brains. You record from both of them. So you get recording A from the first one, you get recording B from the second one. And then you build some kind of a mapping function or mapping model between them. Then if you also want to map between model and brain, and by model, I really mean brain model to be more precise. So brain model is a model that tries to match the brain in certain aspects. Then we can again record from both of them, and the mapping function or the mapping model between the model, the brain model, and the participant recordings should be identical to the one that was used between two brains. So if you find that a linear function is sufficient to map between two recordings of two participants, then a model should not get access to a more powerful mapping function than the one that was used between two brains. And indeed, in practice, this is currently overwhelmingly linear. So most of the work that at least I'm aware of uses just linear regression to map between brain and brain, as well as model and brain. Although it is also unclear if the neural representations in really all brain regions are linearly translatable between subjects. Most of my experience is in vision, and I think Ko might maybe tell us some more about that later. But at least there, it seems like you can pretty robustly predict neural representations in another brain by linearly mapping from a source brain. But it's not clear that this will work out in every single brain region. It could be that in some other neural recording data set, this will not work out. Okay, and finally, assumption 5, the linkage function from neurons to behavior needs to explain all behavioral from neural data. And ideally, it should again be the simplest linkage function we can think of, but that still explains all the data. So to give a bit more context of what I mean, if we think of vision again with the ventral stream and the areas V1, V2, V4, and IT, and we want to somehow figure out which of these areas are the ones that contribute to object recognition behavior, then usually what is currently done is we fit a linear regression from each recordings from each single area, and we ask, do all of them linearly predict? And then work from Ha Hong and Dan Yeomans has shown that if we fit a linear regression from IT to the behavior, then that seems to get pretty close to the actual behavior itself. So that seems to be a pretty good predictor. All of this is, however, under the assumption that the behavioral readout is indeed linear, which I think currently is not fully, we don't really have full experimental data to suggest this, although I'd be curious to hear results if there are any. So I think it's unclear if the behavioral readout is really mechanistically linear in all of these cases. Who is to say that there's not a nonlinear transformation to behavior that doesn't go through IT, which also would explain the data. So how do we think about which map or which behavioral linkage functions are more correct than others? And how do we constrain the models to then do the same? Because ideally, if we can link from brain IT to behavior, then the same should be true in the model. If we should be able to link from brain model IT to brain model behavior. Okay, so putting all of this together, the assumptions are, first, we want to build an accurate model of the brain. And then second, to decide which model is most accurate, we test models on many benchmarks. This is this idea of integrated benchmarking. We allow the brain models to be nonlinear because the brain also seems to make nonlinear transformations. But with respect to assumption 4, to map between model and brain, we want to use the minimal function which works for brain and brain. And the question here is this linear or nonlinear? In practice right now, everyone uses linear. I think it is not fully established by experimental data though. And fifth, the neurons to behavior linkage function needs to explain all behavior from neural data. And again, the question is this linear or nonlinear? To put this in a bit of a picture and maybe also put up the definitions again. So we have a brain model on the left, so we call this a brain model, primates on the right. If we connect between brain model recordings and primate recordings, we do this with a mapping function or a mapping model. And if we connect neural representations, be they from the brain model or the primate brains, then we do this with a behavioral readout or a behavioral model. So these are the assumptions. And I think especially with respect to assumptions 4 and 5, it would be interesting to discuss which experiments, be they biological or computational, would support linear or nonlinear in these cases. For our proposal, we can also, or for our opinion paper that we're eventually going to write for CCN, we are supposed to also run some experiments. So it would be great to hear from you all which you think would be most beneficial here. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much to both of you, Anna and Martin. So we now have some time for questions and a discussion, critical discussion in particular about the assumptions, but I think we can talk about anything else as well. So there is a few, so maybe Martin, if you could stop sharing slides, then everyone can see all the speakers again. And then if the panelists can turn on their video, maybe then we can have a nice discussion. So the first question here in the open questions that is voted high is by Marina Toneva, and they ask, what does comparing the performance of 2 deep models with different architectures trained on different amounts of data in different data domains? So what can that tell us about the brain? It seems like a good way to benchmark how close models have gotten to meaning representation in the brain, but how can we actually use this to learn something new about the brain? Who would like to give that a shot?
I can try to take this. So my first response would be, we've learned that one model is better than the other. That's most of what I'm after. I'm mainly after the most accurate model. That's, I think, my main response. But then also, if you compare the learned representations of these models that are trained with different objective functions. So for instance, let's say in language, if you train for next word prediction, as opposed to predicting grammaticality or sentence similarity, then these broad trends across the models might tell you that one objective function is more aligned to the other, and therefore might also be what is employed in the brain. So for instance, if next word prediction actually correlates with good representations for predicting brain representations, and others don't, then I think that makes a pretty clear case for predictive processing being employed in human language processing as well.
Would anyone else like to add anything to that? Okay, let's move to the next question. Erkin asks, brain likeness is interpreted by first fitting a GLM, a linear explanation of brain signals, then matching it to DNN features trained on large image data sets. Could it be that we are measuring the smoothness of the DNN more than how it behaves like a brain? So because the GLM produces smooth representations. Anyone who feels like jumping in there?
Well, this one actually, maybe if Erkin wants to go live and comment on the question a little bit too, it might be useful to just, you know, jump into the discussion if we can do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would definitely be helpful.
Let's see if I can promote him here.
Okay, no, I think that's not an option.
Erkin, do you want to explain? You can talk if you unmute yourself.
I think is it in the chat that it's not good for him right now.
Okay.
Okay.
That is
yeah,
fine.
I mean, like, yeah, let us know if you want to elaborate. I think so. This particular question, right, is about fitting fMRI data, right, which is why we're talking about GLM, right, to neural network representations, right? So like a subset of all the potential mappings we can talk about. And so for this particular mapping, right, I guess the question is that the general linear model, which allows us to measure how strongly each voxel responds to a particular stimulus or a particular dimension, the GLM already carries a linearity assumption in itself to some extent. And no, it's an interesting question. I think, yeah, like indeed, you know, if we want to be building on top of the GLM, then what we're allowing for is for the features to interact in a nonlinear way, right? But not necessarily kind of get into the nitty-gritty of nonlinear computations performed by the brain, right? Like we're not tapping into recurrence, we're not tapping into the fMRI signal potentially plateauing at the top, which we think are reasonable assumptions, but it is indeed a good, you know, some additional assumption to keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's really important that this question gets at is the fact that often our measurements of the brain are not direct measurements, but they are mediated through some kind of measurement instrument. And I feel like that places important, leads us to make important considerations about to what extent we should or should not use nonlinear models in that context.
Yeah, there was a question related to that as well that Stefano, you already answered in the Q&A session here. I don't know if you want to comment on that again, about whether you should be always testing linear and nonlinear models to figure out which one are better.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be an promising approach, but one of the challenges, as I was saying in the response, is like a little bit what Martin talked about, right? That is that often is you need to decide what does it mean that one model is better than another, and it's not necessarily the case that the model that has a higher predictive accuracy is considered a better model. It may depend on the kind of purposes that researchers have in mind for using that particular model.
Great. Eric DeWitt asks, with linear models and analyses, there's a clear cutoff, the definition of a linear transformation. However, with nonlinear models and analyses, there's a wide range of nonlinear mappings, which we might consider to be arranged, for example, by divergence from linear, etc. Do we need to consider the degree of nonlinearity in this discussion?
I'll take that. So I think that's a great question. And I think we need to consider a measure of complexity of the model. And so there's a trade-off between the explanatory power or predictive power and complexity. And linear models are not necessarily the sweet spot of this trade-off. And so there's a benefit, I think, to looking at this more broadly. But I don't know. Others in the panel want to chime in about this.
Yeah, I mean, some linear models may be more complex than some nonlinear models. So I feel like there's broad agreement that we need some ways of constraining model complexity, both for interpretability and for dealing with the fact we have limited data. But I guess the kind of discussion is, should these constraints about model complexity should be cast in terms of linear versus nonlinear, or rather in some other way?
There's a follow-up question in the chat. What would be a good measure for complexity? Do you know, Giovanna?
I think that's a great question. And I'm not sure if we have a great answer. There are some natural notions of complexity that can be measured, for example, by the mutual information. So that captures the representational complexity, right? How much memory, how much bits you need in order to store the model, for example. But there may be other notions of complexity. And so one of the a nice outcome of this proposal would be to come up with a good measure of complexity for understanding the brain.
Yeah, and I also want to mention that our discussion was in part inspired by a discussion in a related field, the field of natural language processing, because they are facing a similar problem to ours, right? Instead of interpreting activity in a particular brain regions, they're trying to interpret activity in a particular layers of a deep neural network. And they are encountering, like us, is that it's not always straightforward to define what it is we want from a mapping model. And essentially, I think, our field and theirs are starting to explore these questions in parallel with the use of information theoretic tools, right? In addition to mutual information that Noga mentioned, there are some attempts to use minimum description length. There are some attempts to use mutual information constrained by the type of mapping. So for example, like within the type of linear models within the class of multi-layer perceptrons. So we don't have an answer for how to measure complexity best, but I think it's at the heart of the question of what model. In order to answer what model to use, we need to figure out how to measure complexity and what is the sweet spot.
Yeah, so follow up to that question by Ralph. Ralph says essentially, shouldn't that be based, so even if it's linearity, shouldn't that be based on actual spikes which communicate most of the information in the brain rather than this highly nonlinear measurement that you get from fMRI? So linearity on Bolt would be super complex for a readout to be implemented within the brain. And there's actually a related question, or pretty much the same question formulated differently in the Q&A by Nicholas Blauch. He says, even if nonlinear models of non-linearly encoded representations provide some initial insight into some domain, shouldn't they ultimately be replaced by a linear model of a different non-linearly encoded representation?
I can start. I mean, so this also goes back to an earlier question too. And I think one of the promising things about linear models is that they work not just when you have the GLM assumption, and I agree, it's complex to think about linear mapping from fMRI data to anything because fMRI is such a nonlinear combination of signals. But we see the same methods seem to work very well and show very similar correspondence between spiking data and fMRI. And I think it would just compound the problem to add a nonlinear model on top of a nonlinear measure, right? Or it could potentially compound the problem. So if anything, I think moving more into the nonlinear domain is even more complicated potentially in fMRI.
That's great. So yeah, as you know, for team nonlinear, my just a brief consideration on that is that as we were saying, though, the fMRI responses are likely nonlinearly related to the underlying neural activity. And so when we look at the features that are represented in some layer of a neural network, we have in some ways some very privileged measurement of what's going on in those features, because we can directly look at, okay, how intense is the response in these different features, which we can't really see with MRI. And often to predict MRI responses from these models, people can use encoding models that are linear by virtue of appealing to a nonlinearity that's built into some hemodynamic response function that is taken, for example, to be standard. And so features responses are convolved with this standard HRF and used as predictors of fMRI responses. However, we know that, for example, there's variability in the shape of the hemodynamic response function across different regions and even across different voxels. And so sometimes we could even get better predictions from accurate models if we allowed for a small number of parameters that model the nonlinear shape of the HRF and the way it may depend on different voxels. And in this case, that could help us to, maybe account for the fact that when we look at the responses in the neural network, we have direct access to them. Whereas when we look at the fMRI responses, what we see is mediated by this nonlinear transformation that can vary from region to region. And I guess this gets a little bit also to the questions about minimal functions and the brain-to-brain relationship that Martin was discussing, because in the case of fMRI, I feel like that sometimes can be a challenging idea, because if you compare two brains, in both cases, you're looking at some measurement which already went through the nonlinear transformation of the pulse response. Instead, when you're relating the features in a layer to a brain, those features you have direct access to. And so the functions that may work to predict brain-to-brain in a context such as fMRI may not work as well for predicting feature-to-brain potentially because of that.
Great. Would anyone add some last words to this discussion? Because I think we should move on after this. Awesome. Then Leila, Isaac, you're up next. So now we're going to be talking about vision in particular, first from Team Linear and then Team Nonlinear.
Great.
So if you want to share your slides.
Do that.
Great.
Sorry, it always takes me a second to optimize this. All right, can everyone see?
Yeah, that works great.
All right, I'll start my timer too. So I'm going to be talking about extracting high-level visual and social information from the human brain using linear encoding and decoding models. So to guide the debate, each presenter going forward has been asked to start with a slide like this to frame our position. So this was the same question you were just posed on a scale of 1 to 10. Where do you fall from team linear to team nonlinear? And I would put myself at about a 2, which I guess is different than I'm on the more extreme end of this debate compared to most of you. The domain I study is vision, and in particular social vision. The methodology I'm going to talk about today is fMRI. And I'm going to be talking about mapping from brain activity to behavior. Today, though, not live behavior while the person is doing a task, but a set of predefined human judgments on different stimuli. All right, so why linear models? So as cognitive neuroscientists, we're interested in understanding neural representations, not simply in improving classification accuracy. So I think it's important to let the neural features do the work for us. Related to that, I think it can be complicated, and there was just a great question about this, about where you draw the line with a nonlinear classifier. And then finally, I'm going to talk about some of the interpretability of linear models. And I'm going to be discussing these 3 points in the context of a specific problem, third-party social interaction perception. So this is how we recognize other people's social interaction from visual input. And other people's social interactions tell us all sorts of relevant information. They tell us who's friend or foe, who has power over whom, and currently they also tell us useful information about who is observing good social distancing or not. And all of this influences the personal decisions we make. And so, in other words, this information is really critical for determining social structure in the world. These abilities to recognize other people's social interactions develop early in infancy and are shared with other primates. There are dedicated brain regions in both the macaque and humans for recognizing this information. And so my goal is to really understand what type of social interaction information is represented in this brain region. And so I'm going to talk about one specific case, trying to understand helping versus hindering interactions. So this is a really key distinction that even infants and primates can make. So we designed stimuli in the classic style of Hyder and Simmel, where one shape is trying to achieve a goal and the second shape either helps it or hinders it. And we designed 10 sets of these stimuli. And using a linear SVM, we asked if the voxel activity in different brain regions could distinguish between helping versus hindering. And we used a cross-validation scheme where we held out one scenario at a time. And we did this to try and avoid low-level visual confounds. So the help and hinder scenario scenes in a given scenario look much more similar to each other visually than they do to any of the other scenes. So this is a pretty strong test of generalization. And I can look at the classification accuracy in each brain region. So starting with this social interaction region we identified in the PSTS, you see that you can significantly above chance tell whether somebody is watching a helping or hindering video based on the pattern of voxel activity. This information is also present in the TPJ, a region that codes for other agents' mental states. However, importantly, you cannot decode it from information in motion selective region MT. And this, I think, highlights that question I asked, which is where do you draw the line with a nonlinear classifier? So this information is not linearly separable in MT, right? And imagine, but we know that motion cues, which are represented in MT, can be multiplicatively combined to tell apart helping and hindering in computational models with Hyder and Simmel style scenarios like the ones I showed. And so imagine with a complicated enough nonlinear classifier, you could read out this information with MT if you had the right nonlinear model. And some might see this as a pro, but I think ultimately it's a con because it's unlikely that the downstream neurons are combining information in such a complicated manner. So this is a version of the Anya's image on the retina, DNN on the retina argument, but I think demonstrates that this is a really important question that's difficult to reconcile with nonlinear models. And I think it can lead to incorrect conclusions about what information is represented in what brain regions. So in other words, I think it's really hard to understand what is a fair nonlinear model. So in the second part of my talk, I'm going to discuss more recent work looking at social interaction perception and more natural vision. And this is work done by my postdoc, Haimi Lee Messel. But to sum up, why linear models? So I think you should let the neural features do the work. And I show that even high-level information like the presence of a social interaction or the nature of that social interaction, helping versus hindering, is linearly separable in the right brain regions. However, low-level information can also be combined in overly complex ways to extract the same information. So I think we need to, as a field, if we are going to delve into nonlinear models, really be careful about the standards we use for applying them. And then finally, I showed that it's very straightforward to extract feature representations from linear mapping, even in complex naturalistic stimuli. So I think I'm out of time, and I will end there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I will promote Kuichi. There we go.
Hey.
Awesome. That worked.
Yeah, I was kind of nervous.
Sorry.
But you have disabled screen sharing, so that needs to be fixed, I guess.
Oh.
Oh, I'm co-host now, so I guess I can share.
You can do that.
Yes,
Perfect.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Take it away.
Okay, so without wasting too much time on the topic, I'm team nonlinear. I voted 7 out of 10. So I'm gonna, for the sake of debate, be very strongly supportive of nonlinear models. My domain is vision. cognition to some extent, visual cognition. Methods that I use are primarily study vision with multi-electrode recording, causal perturbation, behavior. I'm not going to talk too much about my own work today. I'm going to give a sort of overview of vision and models that are used in vision. I'm going to get into mapping, and Anya set it up very nicely, I think, already. So this talk will be mostly based on what models do we actually use in vision, what is biological plausibility, linear versus nonlinear, interpretability of those models. Before I go into nonlinear models, I want to concede to linear methods for certain aspects. And one of them is like if you show a stimuli to your animal model of choice, or you make them do some task, you can measure neural signals or behavioral signals. And I've been kind of generous here to put both signals in the neural domain, but yeah, I'll keep it there. So you can measure these signals, and you can also build, when you're building models, you can show the same kind of stimuli to the models and make predictions of the same type of signals, neural and behavioral. And then you can compare these two. And I think Martin refers to this as also like mapping between monkeys to monkeys or humans to humans. So you can replace the right side, like computational models, with maybe humans, another example human, or another example monkeys. So here, I think I will concede that linear methods are important and are useful, although we haven't really, this is a very unexplored domain. So I think maybe in the future, nonlinear models will be even more important in this domain. But coming back to the general adversarial collaboration, today's topic, I just want to briefly go back to the background that was mentioned. It's like, okay, we are going to map patterns of brain activity to some measure, and those measure could be, neural signals. The brain activity is like neural signals, spikes, LFP, both signal. The measure could be something like a stimulus, some function like a orientation of a Gabor, or maybe the object present in an image, and I have to model this relationship between stimulus and neural signals, so which we will call the encoding model. There's another one which is behavioral measure, and a model between behavioral measure and brain activity that is modeling the neural signals to this kind of behaviors, which we'll call the decoding model. And I'm going to, for the purpose of this talk, leave out this other part, which is the brain activity in another species. So when I think of models, encoding models going from stimulus to neural signals, or decoding models going from neural signals to behavior, I don't really know what we are talking about when we say linear models, because if you look at levels of investigation in neuroscience, and I've laid it out here from Churchill and Sinosky's work, like there could be different levels of investigation. Let me start from the very lower level, which is at the level of molecules, synapses, and neurons. The first model that comes to my mind, or the first way of looking at stimulus-dependent responses of neurons, is actually to directly stimulate a neuron with some current. And the model that's very popular here in this domain, I think we should all know about it, is the Hodgkin-Huxley model. And that's a highly nonlinear model. And it's not only nonlinear, the nonlinearity actually maps to some physical properties of these neurons, of the channels in these neurons. So the ground truth is very nonlinear, but in systems neuroscience, we sort of abstract away from ground truth as we make the system more and more complex. So, but what I will try to present in the next slide is that even though we want to have this abstraction, we cannot really run away from nonlinear models. So for example, we can take these spikes and say these sort of membrane voltage fluctuations, and say we're going to call them events, and these events as spikes. So how do we model the spike generation? And the most common models of spike generations are this homogeneous Poisson process, again, nonlinear models. Now, let's take neurons. Let's do extracellular recordings in neurons, and we can show different kind of stimuli to these neurons and measure these sort of spikes, these sort of membrane voltages, and then get to spikes, and then even transform the spikes into sort of spike density functions or rate functions, for example, which looks like this, also very nonlinear looking. We can say, hey, let's abstract away from that and just take some time window and just count the number of spikes in there. And then we can plot them against our variable, stimulus variable, that is the orientation of the stimulus. And we end up getting something that is the orientation tuning curve, which is also, again, a nonlinear model. So we cannot really run away from nonlinear models, it seems like to me. Classic V1 models of like of simple cells, for example, to naturalistic stimuli, they're also this linear stimulus filter, but followed by nonlinearity and Poisson spiking. So it's a nonlinear model. And I'm not talking about complex cells or divisive normalization, just simple cells. And even these models, mapping stimulus to neurons, are currently arguably best described by or explained by deep convolution neural network models, which we all know are nonlinear models. So going back to the further up in the systems, maybe with the human fMRI world, most visual cortical voxel activity are best predicted by these sort of nonlinear models, either some of the second order contrast model for areas V1 to V4, or for example, deep convolution models for areas like human IT. So coming to the biological plausibility of these models, I think no nonlinear model is biologically plausible at all. And I'm happy to debate about this in the discussion section. So especially for stimulus to neural activity, like if you think of a stimuli like an image hitting the retina and look at models of the retina, each component of the retina cannot be linearly modeled. So going from there to like the whole brain, it just gets complicated. Like we have shown that deep convolution neural networks are very good models of areas like mid-level areas like V4. You know, there's a lot of recurrence that Anya also mentioned. This makes the systems highly nonlinear. When we talk about linearity, we often ignore the fact that the brain is a dynamic system. It has time in it. So all these simplifications lead to the idea that, oh, linear models are good and they're somewhat interpretable and stuff like that. So I think we should really consider what is the main goal here, because it seems like for most purposes, linear models don't really work that well. Even for neurons to behavior, we have heard Leila talk about some mapping between voxel activity and behavior, but there is plenty of work in the visual field, like, you know, rise to bound models, that's evidence accumulation models, or even recent like stepping dynamic models that relate activity in LIP to behavior choice of the monkey, and these are all nonlinear models. The place where I think linear models are thinking in terms of linear terms help, I guess, is because they're efficient to formulate some sort of hypothesis space and think about it. And I would say it's like, you know, you go to a store and you're looking for Coke and you don't find it, so you settle for Pepsi. And I think I look at linear models like that in some way. For example, this untangling hypothesis of like the representational space is slowly untangled over, you know, the hierarchy of the visual cortex. This is a place where, you know, applying linear classifiers to these representations can sort of like prove this hypothesis. But who is to say that, you know, when we are actually performing and reading the behavior, it's not a non-linear operation that is being done. So this brings me to the last point, which is like interpretability. And I think I've heard many times today that there is you know, linear models are more interpretable. So first, I think there's no mathematical definition of interpretability yet. And it usually, interpretability usually like comes out of two main things that I at least feel like. Like one is like you have a low number of model parameters, then it kind of makes the model feel more interpretable because we can predict the output. How can we change the model? What happens? So, and also like some description of the model component that fit human vocabulary. I just want to emphasize that the cognitive vocabulary is from centuries old, and while other fields have actually really revised their vocabulary, we are still using terms that are from era where, you know, the mind and soul were different things, and so on and so forth. But recently, as you see, like gain control, normalization, convolution, these are becoming terms that are part of our usual vocabulary. So this is a very relative thing. So many models that don't sound interpretable to you today might sound interpretable to you tomorrow. And but the main, I think, driving factor, which I propose, is that somewhere I think this idea that we should make things interpretable, because when we make things interpretable, we can change the model to make it a better model. What is a better model? How do we evaluate better models? For that, we have to come up with benchmarks, you know, like, and what are the benchmarks? We need shared goals for these benchmarks. We don't have shared goals in this field. And I think that is some place where we should concentrate these discussions and debates about. One shared goal that Martin really emphasized, and which comes with benchmarks and models, is, I forgot to say, so this basically makes interpretability either useful or useless. One shared benchmark and goal platform is this BrainScore platform that we're trying to develop in the lab. It's very imperfect right now, but I think with more and more models and more benchmarks, this will become a guiding light for the field. And with that, I want to end my talk and open up the discussion, and thank you, my funding sources. And we sometimes have these discussions in very nice places. So remote is not always the best option.
Awesome. Thank you, Ko. So I think it might be good to give Leila the opportunity to directly reply to your accusations. But then maybe have a quick discussion between the two of you before we go to the Q&As.
All right. Well, thanks, Ko. I thought that was a really fun talk.
Thank you.
And I agree with your point about shared goals, although I am a little worried about being overly metric driven. But okay, so I think my main rebuttal is that my goal is not to build a neural model, like a spiking activity, right? My goal is to understand the representation in a particular brain region. And I think in order to do that, part of the definition of representations is that they're easily accessible, whatever that means. And it's just not clear to me how where you draw the line with nonlinear models such that you can also call, it seems pretty clear to me that a linear readout is very accessible. It's not clear to me what nonlinear models are accessible and how we draw that distinction.
Do you want me to reply to that? Yeah. Sure. I mean, what is that like accessible? Who is it accessible to is my question. Like, is the goal of science to just satisfy some humans who can, talk about it in some cocktail party? Like that's or write about it in books or demonstrate this in museums? Like, is that the goal? If that is the goal, then even those goals will shift with the vocabulary, which is what I think I was trying to say.
I guess, but it's not so much about vocabulary, right? Like, I'm not saying you need a word model. It could be a DNN layer or something like that, but you need a way of relating, even if it's something that I don't have a good verbal explanation for, a DNN layer. How do I relate that to the brain activity in a way that's straightforward, but also nonlinear?
Well, I mean, one of the most straightforward psychophysics model comes from like a Stephen Power law. It's not linear, but it's very interpretable, and I can understand what is happening there. So it doesn't need to be linear for us to really be accessible, for example. So I mean, psychometric functions are nonlinear.
Right. It doesn't need to be, but often practically that is the best way to do it, I think, in my opinion.
I mean, I can see like how, having a linear operation can help you design the next steps maybe more clearly. But I often feel like and AI, the field of AI is sort of an eye opener in this direction, is that I think neuroscience and maybe cognitive neuroscience specifically have been sort of limited by this drive to make things accessible to the human experimenter. And I mean, unless the field is defined as such, like this is what understanding means, it has to be sort of accessible to a cognitive agent like a human. And I think if that is the case, then I totally agree with you. Like we should make things linear and accessible. But if the goal is to basically predict behavior or neural responses or come up with some sort of treatment strategies for cognitive malfunctions, I would prescribe moving away from models that I choose purely because of accessibility to my own faculties.
Would any of the other panelists like to comment on any of what has been said? Maybe you can all turn on the video again.
Sure, if there's time. I feel one interesting part of this conversation is that, sometimes on the nonlinear side, there's this sort of like we accept the argument that linear models are like in a way interpretable or more constrained. I think we really have to think hard about the kind of constraints that we place on models. And sometimes I feel that even linear models may not be as constrained as we may think. First of all, one thing that we consider is if you had a really, really good model of the brain, and then we had a single neural recording, then maybe even rather than a linear model, what we would want is a one-hot model that just assigns a weight of 1 to one feature in the neural net model and 0 to every other feature. And if we don't do that and we just are okay with linear models, we could end up with a neural net that has units that are specialized for responding to faces, other units that are specialized for responding to houses, other units that are specialized, and so on. So a neural net that has very specialized representations. Then we could look at a brain region that has neurons that respond to just any object And we could predict the region's responses really, really well with a linear model that uses as inputs the features in the neural net. And so, I mean, often when we just use a linear model to relate some representation in a neural net to some neural responses, that linear model is free to use anything it wants in the layer responses, and it's free to discard anything it wants. And so that poses some interesting challenges, because if we push this argument to a limit, you could imagine, let's build some neural net, and let's take the features in a layer. Now we're going to expand this layer, and we're going to add quadratic versions of those features, cubic versions, and so on. We're going to make a very nice polynomial expansions of the features in this layer. And we have made this very, very long, enormous layer. Now we can just train a linear model that tries to predict the neural responses from this massive layer of polynomial expansions of features in the original layer. And this is essentially equivalent to having trained a nonlinear model. And so I guess to me, the question here is like, if we don't place some more constraints on what our features are supposed to be in our layers, then it's not so clear to me that having a linear constraint is much more helpful than just going for nonlinear models to start with.
I think that's a good point, but just to address the first part about the one hot layer, I mean, we know that doesn't work, right? That's how we all started, right? Like it's very hard to find single neurons that are tuned to single features. And that's why we've moved into this more population response regime, which I agree is more complicated. But I think if you show that one method doesn't work, it's fine to get more complicated. But I'm not sure we've shown linear models don't work, and we should therefore move to the next more complicated regime.
Can I maybe point out that there has been a comment on the Q&A. Respectfully, I think Co has misrepresented Team Linear. Nobody on Team Linear believes that models should be linear. It is that the mapping from feature space to predictions, the part that is fit to brain data, should be linear. That said, Co made some great points for Team Nonlinear. Co, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's why, I mean, I totally understand where the linear model comes into play. I was trying to make things more, like a little bit more provocative, but that's why I started off with the slide where I actually take a quote from the actual, you know, the proposal, where they give a background, and that's where they set up what models we're talking about. And those models, they actually explicitly mention things that go from stimulus to neurons and neurons to behavior. So I think it will be unfair to say that it's only the third model, which is like mapping from some sort of like neural representation to another neural representation is what we are talking about. So, I mean, I take the point completely that there is a lot of scope for linear models to give us good insights to improve models. But I would still say that once you improve those models, they're going to be very nonlinear. They're not going to be linear. But yeah, I mean, I agree with the comment that was made. And if I misrepresented, I'm sorry about it, but I had to do it given the text in the proposal.
Great. So I suggest that we keep the rest of the comments for later, and that we'll take a 5-minute break quickly so that everyone can get, especially the panelists, can get a bio break. So I encourage you to turn off your cameras. And in the meanwhile, we will try to get all the following speakers and debaters into the room. Back, everyone, and welcome to our new panelists that you will get to meet momentarily. The first one is Maria Toneva, and she'll be kicking off the first part of the debate on language, and this time flipping to the nonlinear first. So please take it away.
Thank you. And thank you so much for organizing this awesome event. I think it's very timely, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion that we have at the end. So I'm a last year PhD student at CMU, and I work with Leila Webbe and Tom Mitchell in the machine learning department. And so today I'll be telling you about my view on nonlinear models and how we can use them for scientific discovery about language in the brain. So in my own research, I work on language comprehension using both fMRI and MEG recordings. And so I actually use both linear and nonlinear mappings to predict brain recordings from representations of stimuli. So I must say that the majority of my research does use linear mappings, but I'm very optimistic about nonlinear models, and I've done a little bit of work on that, and I wanted to share with you the reasons for my optimism today. So before we really delve into this debate between linear and nonlinear mappings, I think it's very important to consider what our overall goal is. So for me, that's scientific discovery. So finding out new things about how language is processed in the brain. So how can we actually use these stimulus to brain mappings to do this? And I think there are two really important things here. We need models that actually give us good prediction performance. And we need models that give us interpretable predictions that we can actually relate to the question we set out to answer. And so in this talk, I'll be telling you about my views on how linear and nonlinear models relate to both the prediction and interpretability side. So I would say the traditional view that we've heard today, and that was in the proposal, outlines that both linear and nonlinear models are good at predicting brain activity. Some people think that linear models are good enough. And a lot of people also think that linear models are interpretable and are a lot more interpretable than nonlinear models. In contrast, I think that neither linear nor nonlinear models are interpretable, and we need to do more when we use stimulus to brain mappings with either linear or nonlinear models to actually get interpretable results. And so today I'll tell you one example from my research that actually shows that linear mappings are not enough for interpretable results. And I'll tell you about a more general framework that we can use to get interpretable results from either linear or nonlinear mappings. And on the other side, I think that nonlinear models can offer an improved prediction performance. And this will be, I think, the more controversial side. And it will be also much shorter. So I look forward to discussing this. So in the past, linear mappings have actually revealed important properties of meaning of single words in the brain. So there have been a few landmark studies that show that single word meaning is distributed and consistent across subjects. So in all of these studies, the authors used linear mappings to find this out, but they also used interpretable features of the stimuli that they used to then predict the brain recordings. So for example, they used a co-occurrence of a particular stimulus like thought with a set of pre-selected words. So my claim here is that it's not necessarily the linear mapping that encouraged this finding, but it's the joint use of the linear mapping with interpretable features. So once we want to ask questions beyond single words, and we want to look for ways to build these representations of multi-word text. So where do we get these representations? Well, recent progress in NLP has resulted in models that perform extremely well across many different tasks that have to do with language. And so we think that the representations that they learn of language may be similar to the ones that we have in the brain. And in fact, there have been a number of studies, starting with Leila Webbe's work in 2014, showing that representations in deep neural network models of language can be similar or can be used to predict brain recordings of people processing language very well. But the complexity of the NLP representation can also be problematic. And so the reason is that these NLP models are trained in self-supervised way and often without specific language constraints, explicit language constraints. So in another word, it's not really clear what they're learning about language. And so there's a dedicated subfield of NLP that actually explores this question about what are the NLP models learning about language. And there's even a whole workshop started in 2018, and it's been going on every year about this topic with a series of papers that are published in NLP conferences and machine learning conferences. So my claim here is that because the input feature space is so complex and we're not sure what linguistic information is actually captured by it, neither linear nor nonlinear models by themselves are sufficient to be able to interpret the resulting predictions. And I'll give you an example now from my own research, how a linear mapping is not enough. So in this work, we wanted to investigate multi-word meaning composition. So To obtain the stimulus representations, we use a recurrent model, which represents words using context-free embeddings shown in yellow and in blue, and context embeddings shown in red. So one thing you might think to do here in order to investigate composed meaning is to use the context vector as a predictor of brain recordings. And in order to make a conclusion about what brain areas or time points are involved in composition or composed meaning, you could contrast the predictions from the context with predictions from what's considered a context-free embedding, or one of these current word embedding or previous word embedding. So what we show is actually that the input word embeddings are not context-free. And in fact, the embeddings of the currently read word is significantly correlated with both the context embedding and the embedding of previously read word. And so this may not be surprising to those of you who know that these models are trained to predict words in a specific context. But it does complicate the interpretation of the predictions we get using these NLP features. So to go around this shared information, we instead investigated a different facet of composed meaning, which we call superword meaning. So this is the composed multi-word meaning that's beyond individual words. And so here, for example, if we have the sentence, Mary finished an apple. And for the sentence, the superword meaning would contain the concept of eating, even though eating is not one of the composite words. And so we have a way of devising a computational representation of this superword meaning, but I just wanted to tell you the few key findings that we have. And they're that when we use the superword meaning to predict fMRI recordings, we see that it's associated with bilateral anterior and posterior temporal lobes. I mean, surprisingly, when we use imagery recordings, we find that superword meaning is not predictive of any sensor time points significantly. And instead, the imagery recordings are predicted well by unique information in the two recently read words. So these findings would not have been possible had we used the original NLP embeddings, and regardless of whether we used linear or nonlinear mapping. So this was one example of how we can alter the representations from an NLP model so that we're able to obtain more interpretable results. And here I want to suggest very briefly a more general framework to get these interpretable results, which builds already on top of the established pipeline of computing NLP to brain mappings. So I've shown here this the current state of how people usually compute these. And I want to add one additional step, which is to alter an NLP model or a model representation in a way that aligns with the question we're asking, and evaluate how this intervention actually affects the prediction performance. So here we're not looking at two different models that are trained with different data and different architecture. We're looking at the same model that has one specific alteration to it, and we look at how that alteration actually led to what kind of prediction difference did the alteration lead to. So this gives us a more concrete way to control the information, the NLP model, and relate it to the prediction performance specifically to that type of information. So in a series of works, we've done different alterations and showed how they relate to this difference in prediction performance. So specifically, we looked at allowing different amount of context to an NLP model and altering its pre-trained attention, and also learning a different kind of attention bias towards semantic and syntactic formalisms from NLP. So yeah, I think this is an interesting addition to this benchmarking approach that we discussed in the beginning. And of course, this is also agnostic to the type of NLP to brain mapping. So we can use here a linear or a nonlinear method, and we can interpret both of these, I think, a lot more easily using this approach. So this was the first part, and the second part, as I said, was much briefer. So here I want to speak a little bit about why I think nonlinear models can lead to improved prediction performance and some evidence for that. And so I have a proposition for you. I think that this a model that is best able to predict brain recordings of people reading language or listening to language would look like this. So as the input, we would have one hot embeddings corresponding to each word in a large vocabulary. And then these one hot embeddings will be combined by a computational block, which would start to learn some language properties of the words. And so these will again be combined in a different computational block up to the point where they're finally combined together to predict the brain recordings of people reading the same language. So this would be a nonlinear model. It would be trained end to end. And of course, because of this, it would need a lot of data, right? A lot of brain data that we don't currently have. And another issue is that we don't know what the architecture for this would be, right? Would it be a recurrent architecture? Would it have self-attention? Would it be a mix of both? Would it be some other computational mechanism? So to reduce some of these concerns, we can build this model on top of existing pre-trained NLP models, which have already learned language statistics from text and have learned how to combine meaning of words for specific tasks. But here the question really is, how much of this best performing model can be replaced by a pre-trained NLP model? And I would argue here that the position that a linear mapping is enough is equivalent to saying that all of the models that I just described can be replaced by a pre-trained NLP model, and that would be enough, apart from this last linear layer on the very top. And so on my end, I think that incorporating brain relevant bias additionally in this model will help us improve the prediction performance. And I'll give you now two specific examples of how we can actually, what kind of brain relevant bias I mean, and how we can do this. So in one work that we presented in Europe last year, we induced the brain relevant bias by allowing all parameters in the NLP model to learn how to predict the brain recordings instead of only just the linear layer on top. And so here with this work, we showed that this model is able to predict recordings, specifically in regions that are known to support language. In the second work, we go further away from the linear mapping by introducing an additional non-linearly shared layer between the NLP model and the brain recordings. And this nonlinear layer is able to learn shared representations that are good for predicting fMRI voxels. And so in this work, we found that this model is specifically good at predicting regions where there's a significant gap between the linear model and an estimated noise ceiling. So we'll be actually presenting this work at the Society for Neurobiology of Language meeting later this week. So if you're interested to learn more, ask me or please come to our poster. And so to conclude, I hope that I've convinced you that we need to do more to have interpretable results than just use linear or nonlinear mapping when we use complex features like from NLP or from computer vision. So, and I also hope that I was able to convey my optimism about the future of nonlinear models for scientific discovery about language in the brain. So thank you so much for listening. And thanks for Anna and the rest of the organizers.
Awesome. Thank you, Maria. So if you don't mind unsharing, and then Jean-Rémy and Laura, I don't know if you want to do this together or in series, but you can start essentially sharing your screen and giving the linear perspective.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm going to first present and then I'll pass the baton to Jean-Rémy. That's okay. Okay, so do you see just slides?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So hi, everyone. I am Laura Williams. I'm currently a postdoc at UCSF, and me and Jean-Rémy are supporting the linear side. So we work within the domain of language processing. We primarily work with MEG, and we do that to try and map neural responses to features of language. So I'm going to start off by asking, why do we choose to use linear models in our research? Well, as I'll describe, they allow us to overcome the issue of correlated features, which is a pervasive issue when dealing with language. And they also allow us to make direct connections between neuroscience and linguistic theory. We do believe, however, that there can be some synergy between linear and nonlinear approaches. So as I said, about halfway, I'll pass the baton to Jean-Rémy, and he's going to discuss how linear approaches can actually serve to aid some of the shortcomings of non-linear ones. So one challenge of working with language is that it has this very annoying habit of correlating with itself. So for example, phoneme surprisal and lexical entropy have both been shown to be important features for speech processing, but they're correlated, as I show in that plot there. And one huge advantage of using linear models is that they allow us to decorrelate the contribution of features in driving neural activity. So in a study that me and Jean-Remy conducted with Alec Morantz and David Popple, we had people come into fly in an MEG system and listen to a few hours worth of stories. And on the right-hand side, I'll show you some results of that, where we try to decode decorrelated versions of entropy and surprisal. And I'll plot them relative to the onset of each of the 40,000 or so phonemes in the stories. So after we deconfound them, we find that surprisal peaks about 180 milliseconds, again around 300 milliseconds, whereas entropy peaks around 50 milliseconds, again around 200. So what this demonstrates is that even though these two features are correlated in feature space, they actually seem to be contributing differently to neural responses, perhaps suggesting they're actually tapping into distinct neural computations. And this issue of correlation isn't just true for those kinds of phoneme level statistical properties, it's pervasive across all of language structure. So here I'm showing you a correlation matrix of some of the word level features in the stories that our participants were listening to. And you can see there's a lot of structure here. So for example, words which are more frequent also tend to be shorter in terms of how many morphemes and syllables and phonemes that they contain. So in our study, we applied that same linear deconfounding method that I showed you for surprisal and entropy, but this time generalized it to an entire hierarchy of linguistic features. So about 50 in total, which spanned phonetic, sublexical, lexical, syntactic, and semantic properties. And importantly, on purpose, all of the features that we picked were supported by linguistic theory. So using linear approaches, we were able to read out each family of the hierarchical features from the MEG signal. And the time course that we observed revealed that the higher order features actually seem to be decodable earlier than the lower level features. And they also seem to be maintained for a longer period of time as well. So just to remind you, why did we choose a linear method here? Well, first, as I said, these features are correlated. So we need to separate the contribution to the neural responses to be able to discover separable time courses. And second, because the features that we chose were motivated by linguistic theories. And we wanted to be able to directly interpret our results relative to those theories to allow crosstalk between neuroscience and linguistics. So in sum, as language researchers, we have to deal with highly correlated variables. And to deconfound them, we use linear approaches because they're simpler. And importantly, using linear readout allows us to adjudicate between linguistic theories and support this collaboration and discussion across disciplines. So now I'm going to, as I said, pass the baton to Jean-Remy, except unfortunately, neither of us own a baton. I'm not sure how many people own a baton. So we decided to pass a banana instead. Wait for it. Go. Okay.
Okay, can you all hear me well?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. What a transition. Thanks, Laura. So can you see my screen as well? I'm going to count on this as a yes. Okay, so here in Laura's study, interpretability depends on two factors. The first factors is based on the fact that the features that we use directly or linearly relate to linguistic theories. And the second factor is based on the fact that the function that we use to link those features onto the brain, this function is linear. What I'd like to argue is that none of these two factors are in fact necessary for interpretability. For instance, you can replace linguistic features with activations of a deep net and yet remain interpretable. And this is what we've done with Charlotte Kofte. We input deep nets with words and we quantify whether the resulting activation correlates with brain activity in response to the same words. When we do so using a convolutional neural network trained to recognize characters from images, we can get a brain correlation score, which varies as a function of time sample relative to the onset of the word. But we can use different types of neural networks. For instance, we can use word embeddings, which derive from deep nets trained to predict the context of words from a given word. So for instance, if you read cats, it is quite likely to have this word surrounded by the word dogs, the word mice, but not the word rain. And therefore you can train the network to link the word to the context. Once you do so, you can correlate the activation of the so-called word embedding with the brain and see whether they improve the brain score as compared to the CNN. Finally, you can use a language model for the same kind of analysis. Language model is trained to predict incoming words given their context. For instance, given the context dog chase, the network can be trained to predict cats. And again, we can use these activations to see whether they can improve brain predictions, brain scores. So why are these three correlation curves interpretable? They are interpretable because different network estimates different levels of representations. Specifically, the language model access the context of words during training, but also during inference, whereas the word embeddings only access the context of words during training, but does not use it during inference, during prediction. And this is to be contrasted with the convolutional neural network, which never has any information about the context of words. It just tries to recognize individual characters. So in sum, these networks can approximate at best visual, lexical, and compositional representations, respectively. And then we can use these correlations to parse when and where visual, lexical, and compositional representations are generated in the brain. This is what we show here. So in blue, and this is when and where the brain correlates with the visual representations. And this peaks around 100 milliseconds after word onset in the early visual cortex. These activations spread in the ventral and the dorsal stream, ultimately become cyan, which is a mixture of green and blue, meaning that this area here, which is known as the visual word from area, generates both visual and lexical representations. If we wait a bit more, you see that the activity continues to propagate, especially over the left hemisphere, and becomes completely green, meaning that this network generates lexical representations around 400 milliseconds. If you wait a bit more, you have recurrent activity, and ultimately you see that the color shifts. It shifts from blue to red, or green to red, meaning that these areas now generate compositional representations, supralexical representations. So overall, we can see how a set of heavily nonlinear models can still be used to interpret when and where the brain generates different levels of representation, in this case, visual, lexical, and compositional. But the mapping here is still a linear mapping. So is this necessary? Well, probably not. This is a work that we've done with Alexandre Desfossés, where we change the linear mapping between the language model and the brain with a nonlinear mapping, specifically a deep net. And we can show that we can massively improve the brain score by doing so. Have we lost interpretability? Not necessarily. We can test the network and see whether, for instance, the length of word or the frequency of words impact on the brain prediction, and more specifically on the brain scores. And we can see here, for instance, that the size of the word length on the computer screen impact the brain score in the back of the MEG sensor early on, around 100 milliseconds after word onset, whereas the word frequency impact the frontal sensors around 400 milliseconds as expected. So in some nonlinear mapping functions manages to accurately deconfound these two collinear features in a way which is interpretable. So all in all, what I would argue is that the issue of linearity may not be the main issue that we are facing. The main issue that we are facing is the interpretability, and these two issues are largely independent from one another. So with this, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I would be very happy to continue the discussion.
Great, thank you so much. So maybe we should do the same again as earlier and give Maria a chance to directly answer and reply to the linear side.
Yeah, I thought it was really great. At the end, you brought up the same kind of thing that I was saying, which is that I think interpretability is not necessarily a function of the kind of mapping model we use. I think it is like an independent direction that we need to work towards. But I don't know if you want to have a science debate here. And I think it probably would have been more productive we had known like each other's work ahead of time. But I apologize, I'm not familiar with the work that you just presented. But I do want to push back a little bit on this, the work you showed showing that the composition, you can use the language model as a compositional representation, right? And you can show that using that representation, you can predict some parts of the brain better than like using word2vec, let's say. And the work that I presented shows that the fact that you can use a context representation from a language model to predict specific parts of the MEG signal or fMRI signal is due to not the composition of the words, but the fact that you have information about the currently read word and the previously read word. So not the fact that you've integrated those two representations, but the fact that you have better semantic representation and the fact that you do have a representation of the current word and the previous word in the context vector, like currently. So I think that's, to me, that's not really, it's just hard to understand because we don't know what is in the context vector, whether the predictions we're getting in MEG or fMRI are due to that compositional part or just the fact that we have better representations of individual words there.
Laura, Jeremy, do you want to say something the other way?
Well, I'm not sure. Just to maybe I'm not sure whether it's going to be the other way, but just to respond on the science part and perhaps not on the epistemological debate here. So just to be specific, what we show is that when you use a compositional vector, you can improve brain score, and this is what the line and the red colors were showing. As compared to a word embedding, so a non-contextualized representation. So it seems, at least in our data, that you do need to have this contextual information in order to improve the predictions of brain dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand that. Sorry, can I just answer that? I just wonder whether the reason why this contextual embedding is working better than the non-contextual embedding is because it has a representation of the previously read word, not because it's like combining the two. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So we also have controls. I think not in this paper, but we definitely did them. We did a lot of those kind of controls where we just put a lot of the preceding words and just concatenate them linearly to try to see whether you can better account for brain responses just because you have more information or more words into play, and this definitely is not the case. So certainly you can improve brain predictions when you have the preceding words, but it's actually relatively marginal. But the key aspect is really in the nonlinear compositions of those words in this particular work.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that work again, but I have some retort. But anyway, I think the science debate can be probably pushed to another offline time.
Sure.
Laura, is there anything you would like to add?
To that part, no, I don't think so. But it seems as if our two teams are at least agreeing on the side of there is a place for like linear and non-linear aspects. I'd be curious, like, at what parts we don't agree in.
It seems to me that it was not clear where we actually disagree in this in this panel, but
I think my point of disagreement is that I don't think linear models can be used to have interpretable results if we use non-interpretable features. I think that's just using linear models and looking at the predictions you get from that. I guess you're looking at the brain score, which is a different metric, of course, which also incorporates behavioral metric. So yeah, perhaps using this metric can help you more, but
right. So I would also say that, I mean, one point that we made is that just because you're working with a linear model doesn't mean that it's interpretable, which is also what you say. And there are a few different axes here which tend to correlate with each other. So you have the interpretability axis, you also have the power axis that you said, but also the complexity axis. Like, is this debate about whether we should use a linear model or like a linear regression or a logistic regression? Probably not. When we talk about nonlinear models, we're typically talking about complex deep neural network models. So I think that that's also like something to bear in mind, like keeping all other aspects of the model stable. What like components of that model do we choose to use?
Great. So I think I want to stop the discussion, the specific discussion now, because it's already getting fairly general. And before we continue, quickly launched a poll about who you think won, team linear or team nonlinear. So please vote now. And just to reiterate, for the vision debate, it was very, very close. I think it was a 53 to 47% in favor of team linear. But I think that little margin is in the noise in that case. So we'll see what happens in this case.
It's kind of awkward.
Maybe I can ask one question to break the awkward silence. This is to show Remy with regards to the nonlinear mapping function that you used. So at some point, if you allow your mapping function to be true or complex enough, like let's say you fit a deep net to the brain using another deep net, at some point you can fit anything to anything. So how can we then still constrain and differentiate between models if the mapping function becomes too complex in that regard?
Yeah, this is a great question. I would like to, before I actually address it, there is one thing that I would like to insist on, because I'm sure there are many students around listening. And even though we have this debate about linear versus nonlinear, what we should certainly emphasize is that you should always start with a linear model, just because it's simpler. And that's probably the main reason why people use linear models in the first place. It's simpler to use, it's robust to noise, you have a lot of really cool properties that go with it. How do you evaluate a nonlinear model? I think it's in the same way that we do it for classic encoding score. When you have a linear mapper, you do out of sample predictions, you evaluate on out of sample validations. And perhaps you can do a hierarchy of tests, right? So if you have a score with cross validation, which is above chance, that's great. If you have a score which is on a validations test, which has never been used for calibrations of hyperparameter and all this, it's even better. And what is probably the best is to do a generalization out of the training distribution. So for instance, if you train your deep net, let's say on French, and then let's say French and Dutch, and then you can show that these deep nets can generalize to English, well, you're probably in the very right direction. Similarly, if you train your network to do natural speech, and then you can generalize to Jabberwocky or like pseudo speech or this kind of stimuli with accurate brain predictions, I think you are certainly in the right area to discover some new phenomena. That's how I would organize the validation of such approach.
Yeah, I think my main worry with that is that at some point, if the mapping function can learn on top of the thing that we consider brain model, then it's not clear to me that the brain model still represents what we tested on representing. Maybe all of that knowledge or information gets into the mapping model instead of the brain model where I would argue we want it to be.
Yeah, I think it's the same criticism as the retina, like detecting a house and a dog from the retina kind of argument, right? And I would advocate in the same way that Leila did, which is in theory this is a concern, and in practice it doesn't seem to be the main issue that we're facing. The main issue that we're facing is not that we have a function that can actually predict and fit anything. It's actually to have something that works in the first place. And in the example that I was trying to show you is that even though we have word frequency and word length which are heavily correlated, we see that the neural network is not using one for the other, is using each of these features in the correct way, even though he could have used word frequency to try to predict the V1 response. He learned in a smart way not to do so. So I think it's a theoretical concern, and we should always be worried about it. In practice, we should not shut the door from or prevent ourselves to dig in this direction, because it seems to be still very important to highlight this phenomenon. And then we should still run controls to make sure that this issue was not explaining all of our results, of course.
Great. So the votes are in. Team nonlinear, so Maria won by 57% as opposed to 43% for team linear. Again, very, very close, I think. So there's obviously a lot of sort of mixed feelings here in terms of what the right answer is, which really speaks towards the importance of this collaboration. So I'm very happy to see that. Okay, so what I suggest is that there's lots of questions in the Q&A. Some of them we might not be able to answer them directly, but I would like to encourage the panelists to maybe answer them in the Q&A directly in writing, which you can do. There's a few very specific directed questions that might be good for that. And then what I would like to do now is essentially invite all the panelists on stage, and in particular, welcome Anna Shapiro and Martin Herbart. I'm sorry if I mispronounced this. Might actually be German, I don't know. And maybe I would like to give Anna and Martin the first opportunity to comment on any thoughts you have, any discussion you would like to have, any feedback you would like to give on anything that has been said so far. And maybe Anna, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, well, like Anna and Martin, before you start, could you please say what questions in neuroscience you're working on, what methods you use, and where you stand on the linear versus nonlinear debate on a scale from 1 to 10, so that we have the same information as for the other participants.
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Anna Shapiro. I'm at the University of Pennsylvania, and I study learning and memory in humans and in neural network models. I put myself very far on the nonlinear side. I think I might have even put it all the way at the end of the spectrum. And the reason I did that is because of my goals. So I think one of the points that I want to make, which has been made many times already very clearly today, is that what the type of model that you want to use depends on your goals. And my goal is to build simulations of the brain. I'm much less focused on building models that decode what the brain is doing. And so I think that distinction for me, listening to all these great talks today, is the most important one. So, and it doesn't mean that, there's always one answer or the other, depending on which of those two things you're doing. But for me, that's a very important distinction. So if you're trying to build a simulation of the brain, I think most of us agree that it should probably be nonlinear. And that's why I put myself so far on the nonlinear side. If you're trying to build a model to decode what the brain is doing, or to decode what a model is doing for that matter, then I think it's much more complicated, and that's where more of the interesting debate for me lies. And I think people made really great points on both sides. The only other takeaway for me, I mean, none of these are new insights relative to what everybody has already said here, is that for me, the lack of interpretability or lack of understanding point about neural network models in particular is oversold. We have really great tools for understanding neural network models going back decades, and they correspond nicely to the kinds of tools we have for understanding the brain, which is another very complex nonlinear system. And so I think that we shouldn't shy away from trying to understand what's happening in these complex nonlinear simulation models.
Okay. I'm Martin. First of all, thanks a lot for organizing this. This has been a great experience so far. Really been enjoying this. Yeah, I'm working mostly with humans, trying to understand how our brain is able to allow us to see the things around us with a bit of a focus on object recognition. And one strong focus of what I'm interested in is trying to make things more interpretable. And I think that puts me strongly into, for some specific reason I might mention later, but it's going to put me strongly into the team linear for the interpretability part. Now, I think Gunnar and Anna were asking if we have anything specific to contribute or specific to say. And while the debate was going on, I was trying to kind of sort the different arguments that came in favor of like different opinions. And I made like a quick slide on this, which I just briefly want to share. Because I think there might have, I don't know, might have been some different understandings of things going on. So can you see the slide? Okay, so I think this was like the way it was presented, like the problem that we are looking at is like, how do we, is the mapping model between like a stimulus on the one hand, I just picked a cute puppy, and the measurement on the other hand, is that like mapping supposed to be linear or non-linear? And I think that's maybe a bit of a nil-post question, and I think we should probably break down this kind of question into two parts. The first one is what I would call the mapping model, which could, for example, be like a deep neural network model if you wanted to make it complicated. And now, if you were interested in the mapping model part, then I would say then that, of course, can be nonlinear if we understand what this mapping or this transformation is supposed to do. So what's the input, what's the output that we want to generate. But otherwise, if we don't understand it, well, maybe we should actually go back to a step and use something that we really understand. And then on the other hand, I think there's a statistical model, and I think that's what other people have been arguing, and that's why I see myself when it comes to the understanding and where like I'm strongly on team linear. If your goal is prediction, then anything goes, of course, and you can use cross-validation, as Jean-Remy pointed out. You might run into some issues with nonlinear models because you just have too little data. So you might need more data, but that's like a specific issue. That's not like a general issue. But if your goal is interpretation, then I think if we understand the nonlinearity, then we could actually incorporate that nonlinearity into a mapping model, right? Unless you're using a decoding model. But if you use an encoding model, you can actually incorporate that into your mapping models. You don't need a nonlinearity. You can actually use a linear function. And if you don't understand the nonlinearity, well, then maybe this is actually getting like a little awkward. And that's what I think Layla has been pointing out, that if you don't understand what you're doing specifically, then you might want to keep your hands off that, and you might really want to relate things to what you really understand. I don't know if this is actually clearing up the confusion or making things more confused, but I think it's just important to distinguish between like the mapping model and the statistical model, because I think that people have been arguing both ways. Mapping model, I'm completely open. Statistical model, I'm strongly on team linear.
Yeah, but thanks for bringing it up. It's actually the other way around that we've been using the terminology. So f of x Martin has called model of the brain, and it's g of x that we call in the mapping model that goes between this function of the stimulus and the brain measurement y, right? So it's the g of x that we are about. Like that's the one where you're strongly linear, that's right. But yeah, I think it's, like this confusion has definitely come up in some of the reviews and our own discussions in the team. I think, we really need, some like good agreed upon terminology, because the word model can be used in so many different ways. In the machine learning literature, g of x is called a probe, right? You probe in a neural network to see what features it has. But yeah, thank you for bringing up this slide. I think it's good. We should all be on the same page. It is the g of x that we are describing, or g of f, yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
can I frontly, sorry, go ahead.
No, after you.
Can I frontly disagree, Martin? Because I think your anti-nonlinearity, I was put in the linear team, but I think I'm a bit more nonlinear than linear. But I think your anti-nonlinear, what you call a statistical model and other call a mapping model approach, I think is heavily fMRI centric. When you have an MEG response, when you have spikes that you have to deal with, you just look at the average response and you see that you have a ton of nonlinearity. The dynamics are heavily nonlinear. It goes up and down and it oscillates and you have like nested frequencies, and it's like, this is difficult to model. The way by which people approach this nonlinear dynamics sometimes is just to fit one linear model at each time sample, but very rapidly people move away from it. Whereas in fMRI, because a bold response is essentially a convolution of the positive HRF, you don't have like sort of too complicated non-linear dynamics there. It's true that the linear regression generally is it's simple enough. But like preventing or telling the field that you should not go with a nonlinear sort of mapping between your brain model, I would say, and the brain data, I think that is unfair for the people of us like who do not just use fMRI.
Should I respond? Oh no, okay.
Yeah, I just meant to say something that's maybe a little bit related, which is that often when people talk about limitations of nonlinear models, they think of entirely unconstrained nonlinear models that could fit anything without any kind of limitations. And if that's the case, I fully agree with some of the concerns raised by Laila and by Martin that there are some risks in then interpreting what it means if you can predict some brain responses from an entirely fully unconstrained nonlinear model. However, I tend to place myself in team nonlinear because I think that there may be many cases where you can have constrained nonlinearities that are interpretable, and they may be important in particular when you try to model some data that have been measured with instruments of measurements that can lead to nonlinear measurements. And sometimes that may be hard to incorporate directly in the mapping model, because if, say, the HRF shape is the same for all brain regions and voxels, and then yes, we can convolve our features with that and then use a linear model to predict. But for example, the more there are regional differences, even if the more there are regional differences or voxel-wise differences in the shape of the HRF, then we could use as a small set of parameters that are manipulating a nonlinear model that links features to data. And we may do a much cleaner job at predicting the fMRI responses and still have something that's interpretable. And yeah, but yeah, I think it was very helpful though that Martin clarified this distinction between the model of the brain versus the mapping.
Martin, do you want to reply to that, or anyone else? To both the comments?
I can actually speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, Maria, go for it.
Yeah, so I generally agree, but I also think that using kind of a linear map to relate the representations learned from, let's say, neural networks kind of assumes the representation is already good enough, right, up to a linear transformation. And I think that's just not the case. For language models, we know that they're not capable of a lot of like common sense tasks, a lot of things that are related to language understanding. And so it's not clear whether we will be able to like combine the representations in an NLP model, even with a nonlinear way, in order to like get us to some reasoning. Obviously, I don't think you actually can do that, since like you can't do it from text. So why would you be able to do that by using brain activity? But anyway, but my point is that I don't think the representation of language in the brain is like linearly related to the representation of language in neural networks. Yeah, that's it.
Maria, exactly that argument is to me why we should use a linear mapping, because if the brain model itself is not yet capable of predicting those representations in a linear rotation, then the brain model is wrong, and then we need to fix it. If you then allow for nonlinear mappings, then at some point the worry comes up again, like you can make anything into anything.
Well, so I think there are two different questions. One is like related to the brain signal. The other one is related to language meaning that's encoded in the models. And those are two opposite questions. Like, how do we make a model that predicts brain recordings versus how do we make a model that predicts language meaning?
I think this point has been made. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I think for a lot of our purposes, though, they're not contradictory, right? Like we are building these models, most of us, not from an AI perspective per se, but in order, we're using them as a tool to understand the brain, right? So like Martin said, if they're not a good tool for that, then we, for our purposes, probably need a different model. Sorry, Anna.
Yeah, I was just going to revive a point that's been made before that I think is important here, which is that there's I don't know if you want to call it a danger, but it's something we need to be aware of. So we still have this mapping and statistical model. Well, anyway, whatever we want to call them, like the more complex your mapping model is, if we're going to call that the decoding side, the more you're putting some of what might be interesting simulation about what's happening in the brain, right, into that part of the model, which is, not necessarily a problem, but perhaps worth thinking about, because it might be useful to be able to partition those and say, this is what we think the brain is doing, and then this is our interpretation of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's something sorry. Okay.
Well, if it's related to this point, maybe you should go ahead. My point is slightly like related to a comment that someone made about whether we're looking at fMRI signals or neural signals makes a difference. So I can come to that point later. You should, if you want to make a point about
it. You can go ahead. I will pick it up later.
I mean, I just wanted to like maybe suggest that one way of grounding this thing, instead of like saying, maybe for fMRI signal, linear models are good, or for neural signals with a lot of dynamics that we can actually like reliably measure, you have to look into nonlinear models. I think maybe one way to ground this is like, the signal that we are measuring, how well does it predict the behavior of interest? And if it turns out that we actually need some sort of dynamics in the signal to explain the behavior, then by all means, I feel like the statistical model should also incorporate that dynamics, and then it's more likely to be nonlinear in some sense. So just, I mean, I rather prefer to not keep this open-ended. It's like measure whatever you want, like just increase the dimension of the stimulus, like show things for 1 hour, 5 hours, like it just becomes a very intractable problem. You need, I think we need some form of behavior or something to say like, this is what I'm studying, this is what it actually means for the model to be doing good, and then go for that specific thing in terms of mapping models and statistical models. And I also agree with Anna's point that we are putting a lot of these things on mapping model. Like the most interesting things to me are being put in this like mapping model domain, which is like, oh, it's like, we'll just figure that out with DNNs and stuff like that. I think the most interesting meat of this problem is in the mapping models. The statistical models will just follow once we have very good mapping models to play with.
One thing that I was thinking about also in the context of what Maria was saying earlier was that maybe something that can influence this decision is also what we expect from our model, or what we want to get from our model. And by that, what I mean is that a lot of the times we are thinking about the model as some tool that tells us if our, say, underlying model of what generates the features is good or bad. But I can imagine cases where we may not only want to know whether our model that generates the features is good or bad, but we may want to try and get some insight from the brain data about how we should change this model of the feature to make it better. And that's a context where I can see maybe how, in some cases, a potentially nonlinear model could help as an intermediate step, even in this kind of situations. That sounds a little bit like something that Maria was saying earlier, where suppose that we now have some features and we try to predict brain responses with a linear model, and maybe that doesn't work very well. Suppose that we use a nonlinear model and it works a lot better. They may tell us that we need to change the underlying brain model, but ideally it won't just tell us good or bad, right? Keep it or change it, but it might give us potentially a bit more insight into in what directions and what ways we may need to change this underlying brain model.
Thanks for bringing this up, Stefana. We actually have a poll for our audience about what aspects of mapping models, or the model going from like a function of the stimulus to brain, they think is important. And so I think, so the poll is live now, and some of the panelists have already brought this up. And I think, it's really important for us to be on the same page of what it is we want from our models. And then we can talk whether, linear and nonlinear mappings would bring us closer to that particular goal.
Can I react to why people are voting, or this is going to be considered as influencing the vote?
I think it's fine.
So one thing that maybe was not super clarify, but I think most of us here are well aware of it, is the order of these things, right? So I think Conrad Cording has emphasized this at several occasions in this paper, but the idea is that it's not interpretability versus prediction. It's ideally the recipe is first you need to have the model that best predicts whatever you want to model. So bold response, fMRI, EEG evoked activity, spiking rates, these sort of things. So you first define what you want to predict, and then you try to get the model that best predict that. And once you have it, you have the issue of interpretability. But at no occasion, I think any of us would say, oh, no, don't take a very good predictive model, and as long as it's not interpretable, you should throw it away. No, it is always try to predict first, get a good correlation score, and then ask the question about how you're going to interpret that. But so I think it is very clear that there is an order of things that we should follow, and not put these things in competition necessarily.
Well, I don't know. I'll push back on that a little bit. So,
okay.
So at what point are we happy with the predictive power, right? Like significantly above chance, or like, are we then, I think a lot of us would argue that I'm not trying to get an extra teeny percentage of boosted in my predictive power I'm not willing to sacrifice interpretability for that.
Yeah, and I would actually like to add, sorry, were you finished?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd actually would like to add to this, because I think that, we are living in a time where the predictive power of these models is going up higher and higher, and the focus has mostly been on prediction so far, and we don't really necessarily know if they're actually steering in a direction that will allow us to actually understand what these models are doing. And I would actually be willing to sacrifice quite a bit in predictive power if I'm able to understand why they are making certain mistakes, or why the model is doing what it is doing. I would personally probably prefer a model that performs at 90% currently, in comparison to a model that performs at 95%, if I understand why these 10% of mistakes are happening.
So I stopped the poll, and I'm going to share the results with you. That way you can all see them, I hope. So predictive power seemed to be really important. Interpretability, equally important. Next, biological plausibility, then simplicity, elegance. I'll use whatever the rest of the field uses. Get someone, there's an other as well. And someone might have typed in the chat what that is.
Can we have it both ways? I mean, I agreed with everything that JR said, except that I'm not sure it has to be so sequential. Why can't we have people who are doing things both ways, right? Because they'll inform each other if we do them in parallel. So there's really value in having a model that predicts really, really well. That is valuable. There's no way that that's not valuable. It's also really valuable to have models that we understand a little bit better right now, in the hopes that maybe that can help us understand our more complex models later on. So seems like we shouldn't necessarily hold ourselves to one or the other, or the sequential strategy.
No,
thank you, Anna.
Go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, Laura.
Can I just, because Conrad Cording and Paul Schrader and Ken Rickey and I have written a paper about the usefulness of diversity in modeling goals in neuroscience, and I essentially put a shameless plug. I provided the link to that in the chat if anyone wants to read. But really, so the one thing I might be able to contribute here, I think that any modeling approach with any reasonable goal, whatever goal that is valuable. And we can all disagree on what for us the most valuable goal is. But ultimately, as long as there is a goal that someone thinks is valuable, we're making progress in science. And we need the diversity to drive the progress.
Can I piggyback on the goal point? So I think that, it kind of makes sense that you have two teams of people, and it's not a coincidence that the linear models want to be able to interpret, and then nonlinear people want to boost the accuracy points of their model. But as has just come up in this discussion, those are not the only two moving factors here. So if we agree that we're talking about the statistical mapping side, well, depending on the stimulus mapping that you chose, maybe you're actually going to choose a different, you're going to favor a linear or non-linear model. Or again, if you're using MEG data or fMRI data, maybe again, that's also going to influence. So what I think might be productive is okay, is there a situation where everybody can agree a linear model is the best? And is there a situation where everyone can agree that a nonlinear model is right? So we have at least the endpoint settled, and then we can debate about like where we kind of meet in the middle. Because like if everyone has different goals and different like everything is different, then we're never going to like make any progress on this like point.
I think if I may respond and perhaps continue a bit this, it will probably depend on each field, and each question is going to be hard to find one middle ground for everyone. But just on perhaps to continue on this, but on the issue of opposing predictions and interpretation, and to try to go against my own position, what I was trying to argue before, there is one risk in when we emphasize on prediction, which is to concentrate on things that are very easy to predict. So for instance, it's you can come up with like, I mean, the way by which we assess these models right now with benchmarking is using like these random like naturalistic setups, so random movie clips, random sentences, all these sort of things. And perhaps some of the things that are very easy to predict are not very interesting, but allow a lot of models to boost their brain scores very, very easily. Whereas the factorial design sort of classic approach that has been employed over the years precisely try to focus on the things that are difficult to disentangle between theoretical predictions. So one of the issues that I see when you put a lot of emphasis on prediction power over interpretability is that potentially you can focus on things that are pretty easy to predict. But so once you have this, I think, sort of result or setup, once you work on the same data, I think it's going to be difficult to argue that it's better to have an interpretable model than a powerful model. If you were to take a different scientific field like physics, you would like, no one would say, Einstein general law of gravity is really complicated. It mixes space and time, and really it's not really interpretable. We don't really understand how it works. Whereas Newton's law is very nice, it's very simple, so we're going to go for it, and perhaps it will generate new ideas. I mean, I don't think that's how you validate or you compare the models. At the end of the day, you have to compare them and see which one wins before you can do any interpretations.
I'm just, don't you think like this probably is like a continuation of the conversation with maybe JR's point, like would you say like if I made a goal for myself, like I want to predict like neural activity in IT for every possible image in the world, and I show these images for like 10 milliseconds each or 100 milliseconds each, and that's my goal, and I'm not going to sleep until I make this like super predictive, absolutely 100%. So well, what is the ceiling is a questionable thing. Is like, am I predicting one monkey's brain, or is it like the shared variance between multiple monkeys? This is like an ongoing probably research, but I don't think that is like a good goal to say like that's my prediction like game, and like I'm gonna not sleep until I have the most predictive model. Forget about interpretability, forget about like anything that generalizes to other domains. I would concede though that if that goal is, for example, improve behavior during like PTSD episodes or anxiety disorders, like if that's a clinical goal, then I agree, like let's go for that. Let's make the most predictive model that tells me what exactly to do, how to manipulate the brain so that the person becomes better. So I think the goals really matter, whether you want to like wait until the prediction ends that before you simplify or interpret. I don't like the term interpretability at all because it's like very relative. So it's like ability to like make moves in the model is like how I maybe would phrase that. But I think this is very relative. It's like it depends absolutely on the goal. Like core object recognition that I study, I don't think it's like we should wait for like 100% explained variance, because we're actually really interested in cognition, visual reasoning. So we need to keep a tab on those aspects.
I don't want to monopolize the time, so I just make a small remark, which is this first goal of predicting a single neuronal activity is precisely what got Hubel and Wiesel a Nobel Prize, right? They had neuron that they were recording one at a time, and then they designed stimuli to try to understand what the neuron was responding to. And they were like, okay, maybe it's orientation, maybe it's the position, maybe it's how you move the stimulus on the computer screen. And this is precisely how they got the Nobel Prize, right? So, I mean, discarding this as a relevant goal, I think that would be a mistake.
No, I think it's
then of course we should always emphasize behavior, because at the end of the day, this is what matters for evolutionary fitness. But certainly there is an importance in predicting individual neuronal activity.
Oh, I mean, sorry. I mean, again, not trying to monopolize last point. Like, I totally agree with that. Prediction is important. I was not saying that prediction isn't important. I was basically saying against the point that you need to wait until you build a fully predictive model and then interpret or simplify. By the way, like, nothing against the Nobel Prize of Hubel and Wiesel, and he's a visionary and they drove the field in different directions. But like V1 predictivity is still like 30% or 40%. So I personally don't know how much that is actually a work on prediction compared to like interpretability, because the focus was on the stimulus type. So it's not really a predictive like game that they were playing.
I was going to say the same thing. I mean, I think they got the Nobel Prize because they put a word to what each cell was doing, right? It was a Gabor at this orientation.
I want to bring up the point that Ko just mentioned, is that the notion of interpretability is ill-defined. So interpretability was ranked as important as predictive power in our poll just now, and more than half of you mentioned interpretability as the criterion you really care about. But I think Ko was the only one who really tried to like provide some tentative definitions for like what it means. Can you share what interpretability means to you? Is there a way to quantify how interpretable your model is?
Yeah, I can speak to that, I think. Yeah, so I agree that it's ill-defined, and I think that what's useful is to frame it in the terms of prediction performance. Like, if we can change the model in a particular way, Martin is shaking his head, no. Well, I think so. If you can change the model in a particular way, and we can see how that affects the prediction performance, that's one way to quantify how the change has actually led to this decrease or increase in performance. And if that's significant, then I think we can interpret.
Well, I mean, interpretability is a topic I'm like actively investigating a lot. I'm trying to come up with like ways of like formally quantifying what is interpretable. And I mean, I don't know if you know like some of the recent work that we've done in order to trying to like make interpretable our understanding of how humans come up with like similarity judgments. Yeah. And she has something to say about this as well. So I don't know. I mean, like for us, the way was actually that we did it so far, and we're working on more like formal ways of doing this, of automatizing this. But the way that we did is we simply just ask people, what is this? And if people can tell you what it is, and then they agree on what it is, I think that is actually a very good way of saying that this is interpretable. I don't necessarily think that like a hit in the performance, the classification performance is necessarily the best approach to go. But there's other ways you can go ahead, right? I mean, you can look at odd one out. Like you show people 8 or whatever different units of whatever that is interpreted, like whatever the quantity is you're interpreting. So let's say you have like a dimension that's related to animals, and you show them like 7 things that are an animal, and the 8th thing is not an animal at all. Then and people can agree, and what is like not matching, then I think we have something that's interpretable. So I think that there are like very, very good ways of quantifying interpretability.
I think I maybe lie somewhere in between on this point. So I definitely think that if people can give a consistent label to something, it is interpretable. However, I agree with points that a lot of people have made that just might not be possible for explaining all neuron activity or all brain regions. And I am sympathetic to what Maria said, that if you have a particular perturbation that you can, again, describe, and show that perturbation is causing an increase or decrease in performance, I think that is certainly something and gives you a good amount of understanding. But I think I agree with Martin that the first goal should be, is it, human labelable in a consistent way?
Eric DeWitt brings up another potential definition. What about compression or reduction as a definition of interpretability? What we need is models that convey information and are predictive in ways that are simpler than the system itself. Does somebody want to react to that?
Well, I think compression alone doesn't guarantee interpretability. I mean, you can compress things, but also encrypt them, right? So you can get very non-interpretable representations just by compression. So there has to be some other components, but definitely like some aspects of interpretability are captured by simpler models. And so compression seems to be relevant, but it's probably not the whole story.
Yeah, sounds good.
There's also a different level. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Oh, there's also different levels of description, right? And different levels of understanding of the brain and of models, you know. So I posted a few different links that to papers in the chat. I was part of this Nature Neuroscience Review paper where we made the claim that that there's one way of understanding a neural network model is in terms of objective functions, learning rules, and architectures. And if you can do a really good job of predicting something with a neural network model, you can say, well, maybe the brain has related objective functions, learning rules, and architectures. And that's a kind of understanding. And it's for me, it is a deep kind of important understanding, but it's not like, it doesn't tell you what computations are happening in different regions or what are the transformations, and that could be really important as well. So so there's different levels of understanding and different ways of talking about understanding both in the brain and in these models.
Can I add something too? One challenge I think that I've seen when like using complicated models, maybe this is like a low bar for interpretability, but it's like, does it help me adjudicate between one hypothesis or another? And like of how the brain is doing something. Like interpretability doesn't necessarily need to be so specific of how a model is doing something, but if I find that the model is doing something, and because it's doing that thing, it means that it rules out my null hypothesis, then maybe that is a okay bar for interpretability.
I mean, the approach that I would take if I wanted to educate between different models in terms of like what they can give you in terms of interpretability is predicting one model from the other model, and then trying to see if you can actually, whatever it is that is being predicted or whatever you can't predict, those components separately, you can analyze and you can see whether those end up being interpretable. And if they are, then you actually understand what the models are sharing and what is the difference between the different models.
Right, like the I know the nice example that Anna gave in the beginning. If we can use some complicated model and we know that there are representations to read out if someone's imagining a dog, and we can read out the fact that they're imagining a dog, that itself tells us that there is information there. Can we interpret how the information is actually represented and what's going on in the model? Maybe not, but it's interpretable at the level of, okay, we learned something, that information does exist. And then that interpretation then leads us on to be more specific. And then maybe in the subsequent analyses, we choose to use an approach which is linear, because we have specific hypotheses of how that information can be represented.
Yeah,
I want to.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. No, I want to
have...
intervene actually, because there have been a couple of requests to clarify our terms again, because there was some mix up in the beginning. So I'm going to share the slide, one of my slides from the beginning again, which hopefully will make this a little bit clear. Right, so we're talking about the mapping between neural activity and some other variable, which might be a layer of a neural net. It might be like any kind of function of the stimulus that you want to have, or it might be a function of behavior. So if anybody disagrees with this definition now, please let us know. It's equivalent to what Martin was calling G of X in his slide. Does that sound good?
Yep.
Okay, I'll kind of leave it up for just a little bit to let people see. In the meantime, I wanted to ask you all about the biological plausibility question, and which is related to the linear readout assumption, right? So that's another factor that people, many people said is important for them when picking a model. I think Leyland in particular was stressing the importance of linearly separable representations in some regions, but not others, which kind of, capitalizes on this linear readout view. What do you all think? Do you think that biological plausibility is important at all for you, for your models? And what does it even mean in the context of this debate?
I guess I'll say I don't think it's the most important factor for me. What's more important than a biologically plausible or even a linear model is a simple model. I'm hesitant to throw out a term that I'm not then going to define, but I think the appeal of linearity is not. I agree that it's the biological plausibility loses something when you move into fMRI data and the HRF, and you're looking at very complex interactions or MEG data. But I think the simplicity and boundedness of it is important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good point. And I think that definitely one thing that we want to work on is thinking about what are the kind of constraints that we can place on our model to make them as simple as possible. And at the same time, be able to explain the neural responses that we are measuring. I'm not sure that choosing linear models is going to be a safe choice for us to take, in the sense that sometimes what I worry is that behind an appearance of simplicity, linear models can actually lie a lot of complexity depending on the kind of features that we are using as predictors. And therefore that, we're going to have to think a lot about how do we constrain the features that we use as predictors to make linear models also, a safe enough choice to ensure simplicity. And so either trying to see not only if we can predict responses from the features, but in turn predict the features in the model from the responses. And if we have a model that does a very good job of predicting your responses, but such that you can predict at all a lot of what's going on in a lot of the features from the neural responses, then that can be part of user constraint. Or trying to find a minimal model, in the sense of trying to find, okay, let's not just choose a model that does a good job at linearly predicting responses in the region, but can we try and find a model which is as simple as possible and is predicting responses in the regions, because otherwise there is the risk of having these models that have a very large set of features as predictors, where then even the linearity constraint isn't really very constraining.
I would add that for biological plausibility, it should be upon the modelers to commit to certain biological measurements that they think that their model is most relatable to, because I think the biological plausibility is a moving goal, because the more we measure biology, these things will become more and more clear what's happening in the brain. So it's kind of unfair to say oh, you actually had things that did not take synapses or spines into account, and now we know that it's very important. So I think the modeler should make the commitment to some sort of phenomena or measurement that we know about, and then ask whether that particular thing, which should be computational in nature, because clearly in silico you are already biologically implausible. So that computational aspect of it is something that the model captures. I think that will be a more sort of tractable way of going, I guess. This would be my suggestion.
Maybe if I can add one thing on the biological plausibility, there are a lot of tools and theories available to move from nonlinear, non-biologically plausible models to biologically plausible ones. So, for instance, it's easy to translate a convolutional neural network into a spiking net. So it should not necessarily be a massive constraint from the get-go because of this possibility to translate things. One thing that I would like to add as well, which to bounce back on some previous comments, is that once you have a good model that well predicts some brain or behavioral measurements, it's much easier, of course, to inspect this model and to test it on how it should behave in different conditions and to generate interpretability from those. So it's not necessarily the case that non-linear models prevents interpretability for forever. It's just need to add some additional analysis on top.
Yeah, we are approaching the end of the panel. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then we are going to have one last poll asking the participants where they stand on this debate to see whether the workshop today has affected the distribution in any particular way. And the question I wanted to ask is, should we even be discussing linear versus nonlinear models, right? So I think Jean-Remy said that, that's not even the right axis. We should be talking about interpretable versus non-interpretable, or maybe, we should be focusing on the science question and the method question will kind of figure itself out. What do you think, are those kinds of discussions useful and helpful, or, should we be focusing more on the science and less on the kind of methods we use?
I mean, I do think, sorry.
Right. I was just going to say, I think that what seems to have come up here is that the method follows the goal and the method follows the technique that you're using. So, and I would say that the research question needs to guide the technique. And maybe you happen to be in a domain of study where, I don't know, nonlinear models are the best approximation, but it doesn't mean necessarily applicable to the field as a whole. So I would put myself in the goals first, method after.
Yeah, I do think it's very helpful to have an idea of the goals and the aims we have before discussing methods, but at the same time, sometimes goals can be in a broad general sense, kind of shared across many different disciplines and fields. I mean, it seems like here a lot of people seem to agree that we want to predict the brain, but also we want to try and essentially understand what it does. And so like prediction alone is not like the only goal. And it seems like I've heard this both from people working in vision, from people working in language. And with this in mind, I do think that this kind of conversations are helpful, and I kind of largely agree with the sentiment that Jean-Remy was expressing when he was saying that essentially we need to discuss about the interpretability of our models and how they help us to better understand how the brain works, and that in some cases linearity might help, but there may be cases in which nonlinear models are interpretable, and there may be cases in which linear models may not be very interpretable. And yes, if we take the most unconstrained and complex nonlinear model possible, then that may have issues in its application in certain cases. But if we think about what are the kind of theory-driven constraints that we want to place on our models, and sort of go about it rather than in a kind of like statistical categorization between linear and nonlinear models, but rather in terms of thinking, okay, given what we think is how the way our system works, given the theory of how our data are generated and then measured, what are the kind of linearities and nonlinearities that can be interpretable, that could be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's also something I wanted to point out in the beginning when I made this distinction where Jean-Remy was disagreeing with. I think if you understand kind of what the nonlinearities are introducing, I think you are on the safe side. So, and you can't necessarily, I think I was wrong in that respect, you can't necessarily always include those transforms into them. What did we call it? Like computational model. But I think it also is a huge risk, right? If you start including any kind of nonlinear complexity, you might be losing your ability to get something interpretable out, right? So I think the crucial question we should be asking at this point then is like, well, what are the kinds of nonlinearities and the degrees of nonlinearities that we would want to include? And I think so far what I've heard, at least, whether these were based purely on methodological factors. I haven't heard any arguments in favor beyond like these simple methodological like inclusion of nonlinearities. Or if anyone has any arguments in favor of that, I would like to hear that.
Wait, I'm confused. Do you consider like improved prediction performance simple?
Sorry, could you repeat?
Do you consider improved prediction performance simple?
I think this was like in the context of interpretability, right? Where the goal is to build, to gain an understanding of what's going on, specifically like in like the, let's say, region or the time periods that have been mapped. So if you want to build a predictive model and get something useful out of that, that's, I think that most people would agree anything goes, and nobody would care about whether it's like linear or nonlinear as long as it works. But in this specific context, where we are interested in the interpretability, perhaps even of the model parameters specifically, there I think it's worth thinking about what kinds of nonlinearities we want to include and where we want to limit ourselves.
Yeah, I just very much disagree with the idea that we can learn much by looking at the model parameters once we move beyond simple feature representations. I mean, you can always get interpretable feature representations. You can do that. And I think we've learned a lot about the brain doing that. I completely agree with that. But I think beyond a certain point, you're using the best model that gives you representation of the world. And that's just a model that doesn't give you interpretable features. So I don't know how to look at the model parameters there and tell you anything about how the brain, how the relationship of those parameters to like the brain is teaching you anything.
I mean, I wanted maybe to add or mention one other example, perhaps, of use of nonlinearity that I've heard that I thought could be useful besides measurement, non-induced nonlinearities, and that is essentially the idea that when we're trying to look at a brain, it is trained and optimized to perform usually a much broader range of tasks than our typical models are, and also that it evolved to do this under constraints that are likely much different from the kind of constraints that our model are exposed to. And so in this context, it's possible that the kind of models that we train on a small set of tasks without those kinds of constraints may generate some quite different solutions. And that maybe in that case, using a nonlinear relationship from model features to the brain may help us to understand in what direction we need to change our models. So I'm still sympathetic with the idea here that ultimately in an ideal world, we would want to end up with a model that not only is linearly related to our neural data, but ideally in an even simpler, more constrained way, where we can even point and say, okay, here's this neuron in the brain. Let's go and find the correspondent neuron in the model, right? You wouldn't even need a linear model. You could just even use an identity relationship that maps neuron to neuron, right? But perhaps in some cases, nonlinear models could help us teach in what direction we need to change our brain models, so that you could say, well, there are some constraints that our brain is exposed to because of the biology of it, or because of the set of tasks that it has to perform, that are just going to be hard to capture by just training our models to do 1 or 2 or 10 tasks in a artificial setting, and maybe trying to relate nonlinearly our model features to what the brain is doing may help us to understand in what way we need to change our models.
All right, thanks everyone. This has been super exciting. If we could launch our last poll to see on a scale from 1 to 10 how much they support nonlinear or linear, whether or not that has changed in any particular way over time. While people are voting, Ev, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point that kind of got mentioned in passing a couple of times, but I just wanted to bring it up again. And in general, so I like simplicity. I was trained to like simplicity. I don't think it's going to get us to where we want to get in many cases. So I think I'm mostly in camp nonlinear at this point. But the point I want to make, and this point is largely independent of, I think, the goal for which we are trying to have models of the brain. is that with great power comes great responsibility, and arming people with complex tools can be very dangerous. We've all seen that problems arise even when people work with linear models and linear mappings. And so I guess it's more of a call here to all of us who are training young scientists to try to instill the sense of rigor and of doing robust and generalizable science, so that armed with these incredibly complex, very powerful tools, we still do the kind of science we should be doing. And to the young scientists out there, to invest time in learning stats in addition to whatever you may want to learn about computation and neuroscience and whatever domain you're interested in.
Great point. So the votes are in. There might have been a slight shift towards nonlinear. I'm not quite sure. It's still pretty broadly distributed.
It's now a normal distribution with the peak at 6 and 7. So I think it's actually, there has actually been some. No, you don't think so?
I don't know. There's a tail towards the lower end that is pretty solid. So before there was less of an extreme tails, and everything was sort of like flat in the middle. Now, I don't know. It's really hard to interpret. But I think that was a great discussion. Sorry, Anna.
Yeah, I just want to say like that I expected the polls to be strongly skewed toward the linear side, because that's the majority of the papers in the literature, right? There people are overwhelmingly using linear mappings. And so the fact that we're having this even distribution in the debate polls and in the overall polls, to me, highlights the importance of this question, and maybe, you know, a sign that the field is shifting to consider nonlinear models more and more. So it's really exciting.
Great. Anna, do you want to say any final words before we wrap up? Anyone else?
Oh yeah, I guess one more thing, sorry. So we weren't able to take all questions, and so please join the Slack, and we are happy to continue the discussion there. I don't know if one of the panelists want to share the link again in case it gets lost, and it will also be on the website along with the recording. So please continue talking to us, and we're really glad to be able to have these discussions.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining. I just want to re-emphasize Anna's point that this is really just the start of the GACs. This is the kickoff event. Now the actual work starts. Some of the arguments have been laid out. You should continue debating them. People that have not had a chance to intervene yet in the audience, or people that might have even missed this, the recording will be available on the website. We encourage everyone to get involved if it's interesting to you, regardless of career stage. If you have something to say, share it. This is the best way to do it. It's the most democratic way to do it, and this is how we will advance science. So thank you again, everyone, for participating. This was a lot of fun as a host. I hope you also had fun as panelists and as participants.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.